For more chapters, join my Patreon, link in description. Chapter 41, Reverberation of the Past. 1. Oh, Professor Ludger, what on earth is thigh? She had heard that those who did not have any property could not handle the element itself properly. She had heard that people like her were so rare that no one taught them the method to use their ability. So they had a book about non-property magic. Read it. Yes, pardon. If you read what's there, you'll at least see a path you haven't known so far. Lynn still didn't understand how things were turning out. Why did he bring her to the professor's office out of nowhere and give her a strange book? Is this for real? Lynn stared at the title, Understanding Non-Property Magic, with an incredulous look on her face. As far as she knew, non-property magic was extremely rare, and the method to use it had never been properly discovered. When she looked closely at the cover, the book did not have any author's name, nor even a stamp of where it was published. Isn't this fake? It was natural to have such doubts. It's natural for you to doubt it. HM? And no, it's not like that. Had it been revealed in her expression. Lynn hurriedly adjusted her cheeks and controlled her expression. Fortunately, Ludger didn't seem to have any intention of berating her. It's okay for you to judge it after reading it first. It will be more helpful than not knowing anything. There was no information related to non-property magic, even in the magic tower. Did my source code spell exist in the magic tower? Lynn closed her lips to such an excellent retort. So is this really real? Where did you get such a precious? Fate brought that book into my hands. Fate brought this book into his hands, he said. Lynn's head tilted slightly to the side at such a remark. Was this something that could be obtained by fate? Lynn was confused as she spoke to Ludger. Does Professor Ludger know anything about non-property magic? Ludger, in Lynn's observations, looked so natural in treating her that she had no choice but to think that he had actually encountered non-property magic by himself and gained some knowledge about it. She had expected that if it was Ludger who had created the source code spell, then he might know something that others didn't know. A little bit. Really? I met a person with non-property magic once before. Oh my gosh. I didn't know there was another possessor of non-property magic besides myself. So where is that person now? Gone. That person is dead. Ludger's voice seemed to be somewhat remorseful as he said so. At least that was what Lynn felt. The usually cold and sharp Ludger somehow felt like wet cotton at that moment. Lynn became cautious as if she had asked something unnecessarily bad. I'm sorry. Never mind. It happened a long time ago anyway. Then, did that person leave this book before they died? Yes. It is the result of their study of their own magic throughout their life. It doesn't even exist in the magic tower. Why did he give it to her and not pass it to the magic tower? Lynn couldn't manage to say the last words, because she wanted it. So it's a she. Rather than that, what did he mean by she wanted it? Lynn suddenly wondered who the possessor of the other non-property magic was. But isn't it better to hand it over to the magic tower from most people's point of view? Even if I hand it over to the magic tower, that place is full of greedy old people who will not acknowledge this book. No, some of them may acknowledge it, but they won't show it to anyone else, and they'll just use it amongst themselves. It's much better to give it to someone who really needs it. That's why I've been keeping it. It was to hand it over to someone suitable for the book someday. Lynn saw Ludger again as she heard that response. I see. If you read the book and practice hard, you will definitely discover a new path there as well. Then, is there any way for me to learn the magic of the other properties? As far as I know, no. Ludger's answer made Lynn feel depressed for some reason. Although she didn't reveal it on the outside, Lynn also had a desire to use elemental magic that was as marvelous and beautiful as the others. Are you disappointed? To be honest, yes. I wanted to try to deal with just one element at least. Others were able to deal with 2, 3, or more elements, and the talented people were able to deal with 5 or more than 5 elements. Suddenly, Lynn remembered the appearance that Ludger had shown her in the class. Come to think of it, how many elements is he able to handle? He had shown fire, water, earth, and wind, and had even used the ice element in the first session of the class. Then 5 elements, as expected of a Surin professor. One element, huh? Ludger actually pondered what Lin had said calmly, not knowing what was in her mind. Lin, you said it because you didn't know anything, but only being able to use one element isn't something to be taken for granted. Pardon? Isn't it a good thing to handle at least one element? Everyone, to be precise, wizards, is born with being able to handle at least two elements, so if they're only able to handle just one element, what do you think they are? Oh, are they talentless people? No, Ludger shook his head. Those who can only handle a single element are those who have limitless talents that are unrivaled in that element. Lin opened her mouth in disbelief as she listened to Ludger's words, but Ludger's words were not a lie. Although it was only a very small minority of the wizards, there were those who could handle only one elemental property. But just because they couldn't handle other elements, it didn't mean that they were weak. On the contrary, they were beyond it. Lin, do you think the elemental magic that a wizard uses can affect the magic of the same property? For example, could a wizard who deals with the fire element property subdue the flames of a hot fire? Oh, that's not possible, is it? Lin had at least that much common knowledge. Being able to use the flame element didn't mean you could handle real fire. It was also a factor that people misunderstood a lot. That if one was a fire wizard, it meant they could handle fire, so they wouldn't be affected by hot fire. If one was a wizard who's able to deal with metal, they'd be able to handle all kinds of metal, so they'd display great power in the war. That was a false saying. The casting of an element and the handling of the element were completely different concepts. Yes. Usually that's the case, but there are wizards who were born with only one element. The magic they use is completely different from the properties of ordinary wizards. When the others could use at least two elements, single property wizards could only handle one element. Instead of being unable to deal with other elemental attributes, they could rule over the elements they dealt with. For the single attribute wizards who were well known to the world, the magic tower gave them titles as colors of the related element. It means that they are all the ones who had reached the peak of their own elements. So that's what it's like to deal with a single element. Lin fully realized that her knowledge was shallow, and her face became red. She would have looked ridiculous from Ludger's point of view, when she said just one element at least without knowing anything. Even the single element that she looked down on was such a great wall to her. So did she really have to live like that for the rest of her life without being able to deal with any elements? Lin was frightened. Lin, what on earth do you think about non-property magic? Oh, doesn't it literally mean that they don't use any property? Lin pondered and answered according to what came to her mind. If you asked that question to a little kid passing by, you'd hear the same answer. I'm sorry. People say that it's non-property, but in reality, it's not clear whether there really is no element in non-property magic. Pardon? Are you for real? A typical example would be sound magic. Lin opened her eyes wide and tilted her head slightly when she heard the word sound magic. Does sound magic exist separately? Yes. But sound, to be exact, is a kind of wave that's transmitted through a medium called atmosphere. So do you think that it's like the wind element? That's what I thought. No, you're wrong. Wind property and sound property are completely different. Although it's derived from the wind element, the sound property is more of a vibration-induced wave, to be exact. Oh, so they are different. Even if it is not through the air, sound waves still spread through the water. Does that mean the sound property can be called a part of the water property? It's not like that. Ludger suddenly asked one more question since he was a little interested in explaining it. Then what is poison? Poison, you said. It's a little more common than non-property magic, but wizards who handle poison are also rare. Can the poison they deal with be called an element of nature? Oh, isn't it plant element? Then what about an animal's venom? There's also that. Lin explained poison according to her knowledge. Poison or venom itself is a kind of self-defense tool created by plants and small animals to survive in the ecosystem in the first place, right? Wouldn't it be a little vague to call it an element of nature? Yes. With the development of science and chemical knowledge, it is unreasonable to see poison as a property of nature. But poison exists as a property. What is it if the mana itself decomposes something and melts it if it's not poison? If it's not a poison, then the decomposition property may have to exist separately. That's true. However, in the top 10 elements, except for the non-property, poison cannot even be included as one of the elements. The same goes for sound. So why on earth is that? Oh, is it because the number of people who are using it is really small? If that's the case, then those who possess the magic of light and darkness are also included in the minority. They're rare cases as well. But light and darkness exist in nature. Then I'll ask you, Lynn, what do you think nature is? Pardon, well, nature is. Lynn tried to say something before shutting her mouth. What is nature, and what are the properties and the elements implied in nature? Nature. Isn't that the world? But is calling nature as the world too inclusive? Then what's an element? Your face looks complicated. Oh, yes. Now that I think about it, I don't think I can define it clearly. Of course not, because human beings can't define the world recklessly in the first place. Pardon? As she was listening to the words that seemed unlikely to come out of the professor's mouth, Lynn looked dumbfounded for a moment. Looking at her widely opened mouth, Ludger spoke while maintaining his relaxed expression. Wizards judge themselves to be rational beings, and they try to put the world in such a frame to fit that rationality. That's obvious. In the first place, magic expresses the mystery of human rationality and volition. That's what I call a stereotype mindset, Lynn. You should have a more liberating way of thinking. When do you think the metal element that currently exists in the top 10 properties appeared? Metal was not originally evaluated as a property element. Metal was derived from the ground, after all. That was because it existed after being lumped together as soil and the earth property. But as science progressed, and all kinds of iron-made machines and tools became increasingly popular, metal was proudly included in the top 10 elements. That's also the case for the ice element. Ice is just a change that happens when water eventually goes down to the freezing point. Then aren't water and ice the same thing after all? However, in the end, the properties of water and ice were separated. The same went for light and darkness. Lynn. Your thinking is that the magic in the current age is already perfect and can no longer be improved. Lynn felt like lightning struck the top of her head as she listened to Ludger's words. Her shoulders trembled, and she stood stiffly. Up until then, she had thought that magic itself was something that could no longer be changed, something that had reached a distant stage. But was that really the case? Couldn't magic change any further? It wasn't like that. Ludger shook his head when he noticed that Lynn had finally realized something. You finally realized it. That's the point. A wizard should rule magic, not be ruled by magic. Ludger rose from his seat and walked toward the window. Beyond the transparent window, he could see Surin Academy's landscape that would take charge of the future of the era. It was definitely a great place. But if someone asked him if it was a perfect place, the answer would be no. The world changes, and of course, we, as a part of the world, also change. The same goes for magic. The previous 4 elements have already developed into 10 elements, but it doesn't mean that those 10 elements constitute everything. There may be unknown properties that have not yet been revealed. It could develop into 20 elements, or maybe more than 30 elements, and it was a heart-pounding situation for not knowing when it would stop developing. The same goes for your non-property magic. Now it's still a non-property, but later on, that may be named as a new property as well. If not now, then definitely at some point in the future. Lynn had a vague vision of something as she listened to those words. Her successful appearance in the future where she had made great achievements in one field. It was the image she had dreamed of, and it was so dazzling that her delicate hands unwittingly clenched into fists. Ludger, who averted his eyes from the window, turned his body around. As she was dragged back to reality, Lynn unknowingly uttered an exclamation. Ludger looked so different from the coercive look he usually showed, as he was looking at her with his back against the light that was pouring down from the window. The man who had seemed to be a pillar of steel was nowhere to be found. Standing in that place was a magic explorer just like her. Don't be afraid of being different. Don't be afraid of the unknown. Believe that you can be a pioneer in history and be different from anyone else. Lynn parted her lips to say something, but nothing came out. Just as something heavy and huge was weighing on her chest, even her thoughts were muddled and could not be shaped into words. But she didn't feel stuffy or painful. It was an extreme delight that she had never felt before. Ludger's remark tore apart the unsettling future she had been seeing so far. There were no words coming out of her mouth, but even so, she had to at least say thank you to show him her gratitude. So do your best from now on. Make sure you read the book I gave you today. This is personal homework that I give to only you. There was a slight wind after Ludger said so. The wind gently swirled around Lynn's body, lifted her up from her seat, and guided her out of the professor's office. When she crossed the doorsill of the professor's office, she could breathe easily again after the magic was lifted. Lynn turned her body right back around and was about to say something to Ludger. But, click. The door closed faster than her impending words of gratitude could emerge. Chapter 42, Reverberation of the Past 2. After her face-to-face talk with Ludger, Lynn walked down the hallway with a dreamy look on her face. She held the book of non-property magic that she had been given by Ludger in her arms. Even though her consciousness seemed to be preoccupied with something, she instinctively felt that she had to treat the book preciously. Lynn, who was walking down the hallway with quick steps, stopped when she heard a voice calling her. Lynn. Oh, Elendil. It was a soft and sweet voice that had called her. She was a second-year student who took the same spell-casting class as Lynn, and she was the third princess of the Empire who was certainly the best on the continent and was even famous in Surin. Elendil looked at Lynn with a worried look. What brings you here? What do you mean? I was waiting for you because I was worried. You were summoned by Professor Ludger. Pardon? Yes, right, he. Elendil felt even more suspicious at Lynn's strange reaction. Lynn, did you experience any harassment from Professor Ludger? Elendil had not thought of Ludger's behavior prior to that in the best way. It must have been because his first impression was the worst to her. During the first orientation, Ludger had shown his guts by not telling the students what he would teach in his class. Because of that, there were a lot of talks among the students so his attitude must have been really surprising for them. In fact, it was Elendil who had asked that question to Ludger first in a slightly sharp tone. For her who had the right values of righteousness, Ludger's actions were simply unacceptable. Afterwards, the teachings in his class were quite incredible, so she admired them, but that alone did not immediately erase her bad perception toward Ludger that was stuck in her mind at the beginning. Rather, it was even more upsetting for her to see Ludger's unexpected cold-hearted attitude toward her in the werewolf incident last time. It was obvious for her to have bad thoughts when Ludger took Lynn to the professor's office. It's not like that, Lynn hurriedly defended Ludger. Professor Ludger just gave me some advice. Well, he didn't touch me or anything like that. Professor Ludger is not such a pervert. What? It was Elendil who was rather embarrassed when Lynn said that. Elendil blushed and spoke in a rather startled tone. I didn't mean to say it like that. Lynn, you're quite sly, I see. Pardon? I was just talking about him telling you to change your class or forcing you to take another class and kicking you out of his. I can't believe that it was an intercourse between a man and a woman that came to your mind. W8. It's not like that. Lynn also blushed full of embarrassment when she realized that she had caused a big misunderstanding. As she was looking at Lynn, who was desperately trying to say something in embarrassment, Elendil burst into loud laughter. Ha, I get it. Since nothing that I'm concerned about happened, I'll take it in a good way. Really? So was there really nothing that happened? Nothing at all? Yes, I told you that there was nothing. Then what's that book? Elendil had noticed that Lynn was holding a book that she had never seen before in her arms and pointed at it. She had noticed that Lynn had been handling that book carefully like it was something very precious. Of course, she was bound to be curious about it. This is the book that Professor Ludger gave me. Professor Ludger? Lynn nodded her head. Elendil opened her eyes wide as it was a little bit unbelievable to her. She didn't know much about Ludger, but she never thought that he'd take care of Lynn when she couldn't keep up with his class, mostly because of his personality. She thought that he'd kick Lin out of his class instead. Yes. He told me that if I learned this book, it would help me a lot in following his class. Really? Seeing Lin smiling faintly made Elendil feel even more incredulous. Ludger did this much of a favor for her. Didn't that man sharply and brutally point out the flaws of the student's implementation of elemental properties in the last class? Of course, his words were all true, and she understood that it was his method of motivating his students by irritating their pride. Elendil didn't really like that kind of method. Wait. I think he was especially nice to Lin at that time as well, when the werewolves had attacked Surin. She remembered that Ludger had been rather harsh to her, who held the title of a princess, and had spoken a little softly to Lin. Of course, the memory of that time was slightly distorted because of her bad views toward Ludger, but the overall context did not change. If she looked at the fact that he summoned Lin separately and even gave her a book, no way. Elendil had some words in her mind, but she didn't say them out loud. At that time, Lin was concerned about something and asked a question in a careful manner so that only Elendil could hear it. Do you think that perhaps the professor likes me? Lin actually uttered the thoughts that Elendil had only in her mind. Elendil shook her head while contemplating how to explain it. No, that's not it. No, yes, I see. Lin also thought that what she said wasn't true. However, after saying that, she had some doubts as well. Doesn't it mean that Professor Ludger likes me for real? If she said it like that, it sounded like she was boasting, but Lin was confident in her appearance. But aren't I pretty enough? Lin was actually a woman with a really beautiful appearance who could catch the eye of even a decent aristocrat. Her hair color was also quite rare. But her heavenly beauty that matched, it was enough to make Lin's name known amongst all the boys in Surin. Suddenly, Lin imagined the scene where she was together with Ludger. She thought that they would be a good match, but Lin shook her head immediately. No matter how good we might be, to be together with someone I don't really know yet. Lin had a quite strong, conservative personality when it came to that kind of thing. Elendil, who was looking at Lin as she was shaking her head after showing a blank face all by herself, spoke carefully. Have you already eaten? Pardon, and no, not yet. Then do you want to eat with me? Can I really do that? Lin was elated at the princess's offer to eat with her because she had never expected it. That was because she thought that if it was Elendil, there would also be other people eating with them. But it was Lin's misunderstanding. Elendil had rarely hung out with anyone thus far. Her status as a princess was great, but she was avoided by other students because the status that she held was so high. There were students from noble families who occasionally talked to her, but they only communicated with her for political purposes. They didn't approach her purely because they liked Elendil as a person. What they saw was the third princess, not Elendil. Yes, Elendil was quite frankly a loner who went around by herself, even in Surin. Because Elendil was like that, she courageously offered, for the first time ever, to eat with her junior who had become close to her. Oh my gosh. You're the first person who has asked me to eat with them. And in Lin's eyes, who had been lonely all along because of the incident at the beginning of the semester, the offer seemed like a great mercy that was given by her senior. Maybe Elendil thought Lin's delayed answer was a rejection. She twisted her blonde hair with her fingers and spoke. Well, I can't help it if you don't like it or feel uncomfortable. No, I want to eat with you. At that moment, Lin and Elendil, each for the first time, finally had a close friend with whom they could eat together with. After sending Lin away, I sat alone in the professor's room and recalled my meeting with her. I didn't think she knew it, but I knew what power she had, non-property magic. It's not a surprise that the property itself doesn't exist. For me, non-property magic was a new form of magic that had never been discovered, so there was nothing new about it. Because magic had always been new to me. Because I had lived in a world without magic before, the magic that existed in this world always gave me a mysterious experience. Ironically, I, who had memories and knowledge of another world, appreciated magic even more than the wizards who were the residents of this world. The recent wizards with a narrow way of thinking were isolated and stagnant in their own lives. Having experienced death and a new life, moreover, realizing that magic existed afterward. I was one level higher in accepting something than the others. Should I say that the limiter in my brain had been loosened? The other wizards who discovered the new magic would say, non-property magic. There can't be something like that. And even when they were foaming at the mouth, I would say, non-property magic. This is a world where magic exists, so there can be something like that. It had reached beyond the point of being flexible. The perspective that I had and my way of perceiving magic itself were that different from the wizards of this world. Even my strict teacher used to click his tongue with that particular topic when he was teaching me. However, what I cared about while looking at Lynn was not her magic, but her eyes. Non-property magic was just a part of her power. The real power was her eyes. Those eyes. No wonder I thought that I'd seen it somewhere. My old teacher had all kinds of antique books that were typically hundreds of years old that the wizards could no longer find about monsters and demons. It was said that there were no monsters except for a few cryptids, but in the past, the continent had been full of all kinds of monsters, and there were even demons who had handled those monsters. It was only a brief moment, but the eyes that she showed me, I recalled Lynn's eyes. Her eyes had a subtle blue color, but when we had talked a little while before, I had noticed a subtle change in the color of Lynn's eyes. Among her deep blue irises, there were white lights that shone like the starlight in the sky. Her eyes resembled the calm surface of the Milky Way in the night sky. I was bound to recognize such peculiar eyes. Eyes that distinguish good from evil, the judgment eyes. If I'm not mistaken, Lynn is the owner of those judgment eyes. The judgment eyes were eyes that distinguished the good and bad in others, and beyond that, clearly showed whether or not they had hostility towards the owner. It was an ability that could not be called magic, but rather it was literally close to miracle and mystery. The greatest thing about the judgment eyes was that the owner could spot the demons hiding in the cracks of human beings. Right now, those demons are mostly treated as legends. To people of the current age, demons were just evil beings with red skin and horns on their heads that only came out in fairy tales. The product of lies to frighten children. However, according to the literature, it seemed that the demons had actually existed. There must also be demons in this world where magic exists. I died and came back to life again, so why couldn't there be something like demons? And Lynn's eyes had a strong connection with demons. I had seen with my own eyes that the judgment eyes, which were only written as a record, actually existed. In other words, the existence of the judgment eyes that distinguished demons also proved the existence of demons. Another characteristic of the judgment eyes was that, if they appeared, a big event would occur, regardless of the period in time. Fortunately, Lynn's judgment eyes were not in a fully awakened state, and she probably did not know that she had such ability. But one day she would realize it. Is this also what they call fate, the book about non-property magic that I handed over to Lynn? I didn't expect that the book written by her would circulate and return to Lynn's hands. I didn't think Lynn remembered it herself. It's a bit of a headache. The fact that I realized that she was the owner of the judgment eyes, and the fact that I was being faced with the connection to my past again like that. I can't believe I'm getting involved in this kind of event in Surin. I got up from my seat with a sigh. Suddenly, some thoughts came to my mind. If Lynn could use the judgment eyes properly, she might be able to find all of the members of the secret society that were hiding in Surin. The most threatening thing to me was especially the other First Order, who was still hard for me to identify. I couldn't figure out who the hell he was and what he was doing, but that didn't mean I could ask Sedna Rachin about him. I intended to raise my guard as much as possible, but I need to be able to make a guess first in order to do that. Unless I knew where they were and what the other First Order was doing, I had to be as careful as I could. But if Lynn's judgment eyes worked properly, maybe it'd help me a lot. The three musketeers, including Aiden and his friends, plus Lynn. If I use the power of those children cleverly, then maybe. No, never mind. Let's get off work for now. When I opened the door to leave the teacher's room while wearing my overcoat, I had no choice but to stop when I heard a scream outside the door. Ainz. The dark blue-haired girl was sitting on the floor with her hand holding her head as if her forehead had bumped the door. Looking down at her, contrary to my confused inner thoughts, I uttered in a cold voice, "What brings you here, Flora Lumos?" Chapter 43 Framework. Flora Lumos, what the hell are you doing here? Moreover, you're like a thief hanging around the door while hiding your presence. When Ludger pointed her out, Flora stood up quickly from her spot and coughed while dusting off her school uniform skirt. Flora's forehead was still burning red after Ludger opened the door, but she opened her mouth while desperately pretending to be okay. Ahem. It's a pleasure to meet you, Professor Ludger. I came here just because I wanted to ask you something. Act in a proud and elegant manner. She acted while repeating those words in her head, but she couldn't hide the subtle trembling of her voice. Ludger was about to point the slight tremble out, but he decided to let it slide. I don't mind if you come whenever to ask me questions about the lesson, so you don't have had to wait outside like this. No, not that. I'd like to thank Professor Ludger first of all. Thank me. You saved me from a spell failure that almost went out of control. He was wondering why she was there. Was it because of that? But she was there to say thank you. Flora was furious when Ludger stared at her with a surprised gaze. Why are you looking at me like that? Nothing. Flora felt very awkward about herself, perhaps because she had never thanked someone like that before. Speaking her gratitude made her feel something ticklish in her skin, but she was determined to say it no matter what. Thanks to you, I didn't get hurt either. I just did what I had to do as a professor. Ludger's voice, which sounded so flat, seemed to say that he had never been the slightest bit interested in her gratitude. Flora knew that it was obvious for him to be like that, but it also strangely hurt her pride. No matter how he had no interest in it, couldn't he at least ask if she was okay? He was a man whose sensibility was so hard to find. Still, she decided not to complain because she had gone there to apologize as well. And, I think that Professor's words back then were not wrong. She said so while twisting her fingers in her bangs. Ludger tried to seriously recall what her remark was about, not wrong, and he immediately realized what she was saying. What she meant was his nagging when she used the overlapping element magic. Use meaningful magic. Don't lower your value. Was it that, as long as you knew that? More than that, are you all right, Professor? Ludger wriggled his eyebrows as he listened to Flora's question. What are you talking about? You must have consumed a lot of mana. I was exhausted from suppressing the mana, too. Wasn't it harder for you than it was for me? Usually, it should be many times more burdensome for the person who helps in that kind of incident. It was nothing. Ludger said so, but in fact, he had almost fainted from mana exhaustion. He was lucky that there was a mana recovery pill that he had prepared in advance in case of an unexpected situation. Otherwise, he might have collapsed disgracefully in front of the students. It was fortunate for him to have a lot of pills in case of lack of mana. Of course, he was almost out of the medication that he'd prepared due to having to stop Flora's out-of-control mana. Well, I can just make those pills again. The place was Surin. Obviously, there were places where people studied in pharmacology classes, and there were also pharmacology rooms in the research building where professors could freely enter. Since the drug room, where the professors could make as many drugs as they wanted, was equipped with a lot of materials, the professors could just fill out the entry list whenever they wanted and do their experiments right away. How many elements can you deal with? Flora asked while fiddling with her fingers. Why do you ask me that? Just because? You dealt with 5 elements in the class. Isn't that a lot? Ludger suddenly wondered why Flora was asking him so many questions. Most children who were geniuses did as they pleased, and they did not continue to have a conversation with others for long because they had a strong ego. Ludger thought Flora was one of that kind. He also thought that she had tried to use the triple overlapping properties in the class before because of that. Still, students are students. They wanted to see how good the professor who taught them was. Ludger pondered about what to say. Actually, I think that I can handle most of the elements. The 10 elements that most people commonly referred to, Ludger knew how to use them all. He could be said to be the opposite of a single attribute wizard who could only use one element and could achieve the peak of the related element. an all-property owner. However, that was why none of the elements that he dealt with had achieved a certain level of proficiency. He might seem like an all-around talented person to others, but Ludger evaluated himself as a jack-of-no-trades. Even so, it'd be a problem if I said that I could use all of the properties here. Among the wizards who were in the history of the Magic Tower, the wizard who was known for dealing with most elements had only achieved 8. The wizard had the official #1 record that was specified in that could be called the history of wizards. But Ludger had already smashed that #1 record. If that were to become known, the Magic Tower would probably be overturned once more and be in chaos. If there was a short-tempered wizard, then they would want to dissect Ludger alive. In fact, Ludger did not find it unusual that he could deal with all 10 elemental properties. My teacher didn't say anything nice to me in the first place, anyway. Of course, he was the #1 teacher who had the greatest influence on Ludger since he was born again in this world after his life in the previous world. He was the person who had taught Ludger magic since childhood, and he had also taught him how to live in this world along with giving him other tips and knowledge. He had chosen Ludger as his disciple purely because he was unique and interesting, so he just thought of Ludger as a pet. Even considering that, Ludger was quite grateful to his teacher. However, he was such a cranky person that he only evaluated Ludger's source code spell as not bad. Of course, he was also such a teacher who had advised Ludger, who was able to use all of the top 10 elements, by saying if you go anywhere and show it off, you'll get hit by rocks. So, under the serious advice and instruction of his teacher, Ludger never felt conceited or great, even if he knew how to handle all of the top 10 elements. However, Ludger was objectively aware of the severity of knowing how to use all 10 elements, so he had not informed anyone about it. So Ludger had decided to just limit it to the 5 elements that he had shown the students in his class. Those 5 elements are everything. 5 elements, I see, that's surprisingly a lot. Is that the end of your questions? Oh. There's also a question related to the source code. Are you going to teach the source code to all of the students in the class? In the first class, Ludger had deliberately shown the source code and attracted the students' attention. It didn't end just as a show-off, either. Ludger actually intended to teach students the source code. However, he had not properly explained to whom, how much, and when he would teach the source code. Well, come to think of it, I didn't give you any notification. I won't teach the same thing to everyone because this spell is like a foundation to me. There are conditions to learn it. What are the conditions? That I'm only going to teach it directly to the top 5 students. Flora smiled at his answer with interest. 5 students, huh? It's a little bit small still. The total number of students are 80 people. Because the spell holds that much worth. What's the evaluation? Are you going to give the evaluation at the end of the semester? In Surin, the students are evaluated by dividing a total of 4 parts in a semester. It'll be hard to decide because the rankings keep changing for each evaluation. I already anticipated that and came up with a method. It's this. Ludger immediately casted a spell technique on his palm. It could have been seen as monotonous because it was made up of only white lines of mana, but the complex structure that it evoked made the spell not look ridiculous. Flora also voiced a slight admiration for the color that she felt in the spell itself. It's a part of it, huh? To be exact, it's a part of the source code spell that you showed us. You saw it precisely. Ludger nodded. Just as Flora said, the spell technique that he showed was one of the source code's main components. I call this the framework. Framework. That source code, the spell that I casted, consisted of a total of 4 frameworks. Then are you going to give this framework to the top 5 people in every quarter of the semester? Yes. The semester is divided into 4 parts, and I will teach the 4 frameworks in each part of the semester. In other words, the students who can't steadily reach the top 5 won't be able to learn the right spell. In the end, if the students wanted to be properly taught the source code spell, they had to take classes with a burning passion, submit assignments steadily, and do well on the tests for the whole semester. Realizing that, Flora stared at Ludger with a slightly bewildered look. So you have carefully calculated it. Did this solve your curiosity? But can you really show this to me? What do you mean? The framework that you casted. What if I'm analyzing it? Flora pointed to the framework spell that was still floating in Ludger's hands. No matter how few other people saw that spell, it was unlikely for a wizard to continue exposing their spell technique like that. It was impossible to do unless the wizard trusted the person they showed the spell to that much. Oh, Ludger belatedly realized his mistake. Wizards basically didn't show others the spell techniques that they had developed for a long time. If maybe they had submitted a paper or a patent related to the spell, it would be a different case. But if someone copied the spell technique and insisted that it was theirs, it would be a headache. In fact, that kind of case happened frequently. That was the reason why wizards thoroughly kept their own vision magic a secret. Ludger recognized his mistake, but he decided that it wasn't a big problem. It doesn't matter. Pardon? It doesn't matter if it's you who saw it. Especially if the one he was showing it to was Flora Lumos. Flora Lumos was a genius. Ludger also didn't know if she was an actual genius because he had only heard it through rumors. But when he had only helped her a little bit with the triple overlapping elements in class, he had realized that the rumor was true when he saw her ability to complete it. Ah. She'll get first place no matter what she does in my class. Even if she didn't get first place, she'd consistently be in the top 5, so it wouldn't be a problem if he showed her one framework anyway, because she'd be able to learn the whole source code spell. Pardon. But Flora took Ludger's words differently. Her face flushed red, and she soon began to stutter out of the blue, unlike her usual arrogant behavior. WHWHWHWHWH, what on earth do you mean by that? Why are you so flustered? I don't think it's wrong. You're going to take first place in my class and get the framework anyway. And no. Well, that's that, but it was foul play for him to say that. Flora Lumos replied in a low voice so as not to be heard by Ludger. It didn't matter if he showed it to her, he had said. It was just like he had given her special treatment. However, while she thought so, she couldn't stop her heart from pounding hard. Even though she pretended not to be that blunt on the outside, the corners of her mouth kept slightly raising at the fact that this man was having a good view of her. Then I'll be on my way. When Ludger turned his back, Flora called him unconsciously. Oh, Professor? What else? Do you still have more questions? No, it's nothing. When she looked back at Ludger's face, who was looking at her with an unwavering gaze, Flora's face turned red as if it was going to explode. Having heard such words a moment ago, she couldn't possibly face Ludger. Just by meeting his gaze, her skin became ticklish and she got goosebumps. It was weird. She had never experienced that before. Ludger looked at Flora with a flat gaze, who was embarrassed on her own and was at a loss of what to do, then soon turned his back and left. Flora, who kept looking at Ludger's back that was getting farther away with a vacant stare, was finally able to barely regain her senses and calm down her excitement. Right. Calm down, Flora Lumos. You weren't supposed to be like this. She was always arrogant and confident, and easily made fools of others with her own abilities. In Ludger's case, although she had challenged him on the first day and failed disastrously, and then lost again this time, her volition hadn't crumbled yet. Didn't she make up her mind to exceed him next time? She shouldn't have been that feeble already. Flora strengthened her weakening heart. Oh, come to think of it, I was going to ask him what he talked about with the commoner girl earlier, but I forgot it. Even if she pretended not to show her interest in it, she was curious as to why Ludger had called Lynn away separately. Chapter 44, A Risky Bet 1. After the pharmacology class taught by Professor Mary Ross ended, Aiden was immersed in practicing his magic while recalling the visualization of the elemental properties that Ludger had taught him. Next to Aiden was Leo, who was clinging to him everywhere just like a best friend, and Tessie, who had recently joined the duo and often hung around with Aiden. The trio materialized their own elements in the first training ground and worked hard to master the elements. I almost did it. Aiden wiped the sweat that was flowing over his forehead while looking at the wind element materialized in his palm. The memory of the warm and cool breeze that he felt while running through the wide fields of his hometown. Even though it was not perfect, the element in front of him was visualized nearly akin to the wind from his memories. Aiden couldn't hide his excitement at the fact that he was able to visualize an element at that level, even though he didn't know anything about the elemental property beforehand. It was all thanks to the method that Ludger had used to teach him. As expected, he's awesome. His advice was so practical that there was nothing that he missed. Ludger's advice, as well as his manner in helping Aiden when he had been struggling before, was enough to touch Aiden's heartstrings. As expected, was it a mistake that I suspected Professor Ludger back then? Ludger's words and actions were always cold and frigid, but Aiden could feel how much he loved magic and seriously appreciated magic through his tone of voice. People who liked magic couldn't be bad. Most of all, if Ludger was a bad person, he would not have passed on such a precious method of visualizing elemental properties to his students that the others did not teach them. I'm not really sure yet. Aiden vaguely felt that there was something about Ludger. But even so, he didn't feel that Ludger was a bad guy. Was it because his contradictory feelings had made his mind complicated? The wind element that had finally materialized soon disappeared without a trace. After smacking his lips, Aiden looked at Leo and Tessie. The two were also sweating and eager to visualize the elemental properties. It was because the two people were also deeply impressed by the warm flame that Aiden had shown in the class before. Aiden didn't want to interrupt their good serious appearance, so he was only watching, and just in time, a group of students came into the training ground. Those people, some of the students who arrived at the training ground, caught Aiden's attention. The person who had dark blue hair with a hint of azure color lingering in the hair. The person who had a neat hairstyle with parted hair to show the forehead. On the contrary, the one with white skin that even looked pale with a sharp nose, and sharp, narrow eyes stood out the most. He looked like a sophomore with his natural elegance flowing in his attitude, and all the students nearby him gathered around him. Who is he? He made the aristocratic students gather like that. He must be an extremely incredible person. While Aiden was watching them like that, the man turned his head and looked at Aiden. Their eyes met in the air. Aiden suddenly remembered what Leo had said. Leo told him not to make eye contact with aristocratic students for long and not to pay any attention to them. Aiden was not stupid enough to ask, "It's good if we get closer to each other afterwards, so why?" So he naturally averted his eyes. The man didn't give any comment after Aiden did that, either. Aiden had already taken a proper break, so he was going to focus on practicing magic again. Oh. Who is this? It then that one of the flocked aristocratic students approached Aiden and spoke in a loud voice. Leo and Tessie, who were distracted by that voice, also looked at the aristocrat student while halting their practice. It was a boy student who was rolling up the corners of his mouth as he showed a mean smile while staring at Aiden. "Oh, you." Just when Aiden thought that he looked familiar, he realized that the boy was apparently the eldest son of Baron Fellio, who had argued with Aiden at the beginning of the semester and stepped down after hearing bitter words from Leo. Why is he suddenly acting like he knows us? Leo's face quickly rotted as he recognized that boy. Baron Fellio did not care about Leo's question and deliberately approached Aiden's party. "Aren't you Aiden, who wasn't even able to visualize the elemental property properly?" Baron strongly criticized the moment when Aiden couldn't visualize the elemental property intentionally. Aiden and his other friends must have known his innermost thoughts. "Hey, Baron, we're busy practicing magic right now, so why don't you just get lost to that corner over there?" Leo replied with a cynical smile. "Ha, I was wondering who it was. Are you the arrogant commoner from last time? You two ended up hanging around together, huh?" Leo's eyes were staring at the aristocratic students, who watched the situation with excitement over Baron's shoulder. They didn't seem to have any intention of stopping Baron. More than that, the man who stood at the center of the group kept disturbing his mind. "Baron, are you trying to show a good appearance because the seniors are here?" Leo knew very well who the senior at the center of the aristocratic students was. In the first place, there weren't that many gentlemen who held that much fame in Surin. Freuden Wolfsburg. TL/N. Change the prior translation of Walburg into Wolfsburg to fit the context better. He was the eldest son of Wolfsburg, one of the three ducal families of the Exilian Empire that symbolized the wolf. Leo also understood why Jevan had suddenly started a quarrel. In order to stand out in that man's faction, who could be called as the center of aristocratic students, Jevan deliberately took action to create a deep impression about himself. "We don't want to play along with your pranks, so get out of here right now. This is a space for practicing magic. A mere commoner like you. Don't you dare tell this noble-blooded body what to do," Jevan responded with a snort as he listened to Leo's words. "It's because you don't understand the situation yet. And it's Aiden that I'm talking to, so why does a little boy like you interfere with us? Grit." The words "little boy" were just about the most triggering words for Leo, because Leo was especially short compared to his peers. Some girls thought Leo was cute, but Leo extremely hated being treated like that. For Leo, his small height was like an Achilles tendon. "You, Leo, calm down. Just leave it to me." Aiden stepped forward to stop Leo from getting angry. At that rate, the situation itself wouldn't seem to end soon. "Jevan, I don't know what's wrong with you all of a sudden, but please just pass by us quietly. I don't want to fight with a friend." Jevan grimaced at Aiden's words. "Friend? Why am I your friend? This dirty trash. Were you not? Are you crazy?" That was why he didn't like that commoner. It was also annoying to see Aiden looking at him with such clear eyes as if he was detached from the whole world. "If you are a commoner, act like a commoner and bow your head in front of the aristocracy." "Jevan, I don't know what on earth it is about me that bothered you, but I'll apologize about it here. I'm sorry, so can you just pretend that it never happened?" According to Aiden, those words were him raising his white flag, and they were his effort to be as considerate to Jevan as he could. The boy didn't want to bring himself into a fight, as he had never been unprovokedly hostile to anyone. Jevan responded with a snort to Aiden's words. "Never happened." "All right, then I'll let it slide, but you should do one thing." Then he pointed at his feet with his hand. "Kneel down." "You," Tessie stepped up, as she couldn't stay still watching his behavior that was crossing the line. "That's enough. Don't you even have any dignity as an aristocrat?" "What? How dare a mere fallen aristocrat interfere?" Tessie's face froze at his sinister question. "What? Shut up if you're from a family that's too embarrassing to be called a fellow aristocrat family. I think I'm going to smell that disgusting stench. Do you want to die?" For Tessie, her family affairs were the most taboo topic. But Jevan had salted Tessie's wounds as if it was nothing. As Tessie's body was surging with mana, Jevan sneered at her. "I'm afraid you're not even a fallen aristocrat since you're not properly educated." Jevan Felio. "Huh." It was none other than Aiden who called his name, but Aiden's voice was different from usual. As his tone of voice was heavier, Jevan flinched unknowingly. "Jevan, I can't do anything about your complaints toward me. If you insulted me with that, then yes, I could let it slide, but—" Aiden strode toward Jevan. His eyes that were blazing with anger glared at Jevan. "Once you start messing around with my friends, I will no longer restrain myself." "Ha ha ha, so what if you don't restrain yourself? Oh, okay, then let's see." As if he had been waiting for it, Jevan took a white glove out of his pocket and threw it at Aiden. "It's a magic duel. If you're scared, just run away." Aiden shook his head as he looked at the gloves that hit his chest and slid down on it. "Do we really have to do this?" "What if I said we have to?" "All right." Aiden nodded. "Aiden? Hey, what the hell are you going to do?" Tessie and Leo tried to stop Aiden, but Aiden was serious as well. His instinctive intuition was telling him that he must not back down there. His fight with Jevan was inevitable. He didn't want to avoid either. "Good, then bring it on. And the loser is going to kneel down and beg the winner for an apology. What do you think? It's good, right? As long as you promise to keep those words." "Ha ha ha, yes, whenever, as long as you can beat me." Jevan was confident. Although they were fellow freshmen who were the same age, Aiden was a beginner who had not even learned the basics of magic properly yet. Jevan didn't know how the hell he was able to get into Surin, but he must have benefited from being a commoner. Jevan was confident that he could win against Aiden because he had been learning magic from his private teacher since he was young. It was the moment when the fight between the two boys was about to take place. "What are you doing right now?" The cold voice weighed heavily on the shoulders of all the students on the Sinai was on patrol. Although the werewolf crisis was over, the patrol would continue for a while due to the principal's words that stated that she did not know when or what some other incident would happen again. It was annoying, but it couldn't be helped, so I was just walking around with the thought of cooling my head. No matter how many students existed in Surin, would there be more trouble just after the werewolf crisis was over? And it took me less than 5 minutes to realize how complacent my thoughts were. "What are you doing right now?" I asked cautiously, looking at the two students who were on the verge of fighting. Yes, I was a little annoyed, but I still needed to hear the details of the situation. So I asked it quietly without getting angry. Some of the students' faces turned pale, perhaps because they did not expect me to show up. Really? People would think that some kind of ghost had shown up. "You two there, what are you doing?" I asked while pointing at the two students who stood at the center of the incident. One of them was especially familiar, and after I wondered who he was, it turned out he was Aiden, the brown-haired country boy. "You again, huh?" I would jokingly say that he looked a lot like a shounen character, but at that point, I thought he was really serious. Was his opponent an aristocratic student? I think his name was Jevan Felio. Seeing that he didn't look that familiar, he was just a kind of guy of no importance. I sighed. Just because you can't sharpen your magic on the training ground doesn't mean you can fight with each other here. As I approached them slowly, the students who were gathered nearby avoided me and opened the way for me. Strangely, their treatment towards me troubled my mind, but I decided to just think of it as them getting out of the way on their own. I just ignored Jevan and passed him by, and then spoke to Aiden, who was in the center of the situation. "Explain exactly what happened." That. "This is a fair match." Then Jevan shouted behind me. I looked back at him without a word. Was it because he thought I was ignoring him? He was huffing and puffing while staring at me without concealing his anger. A fair match. Yes, I'm about to have a magic duel with Aiden. It's definitely not a fight. Magic duel, I see. It's funny that the first-year students who just came to Surin are suddenly having a duel. Can't the first-year students do that? Why is this guy being like this? Did he eat something wrong? I was a little confused when a boy who usually wouldn't even meet my eyes properly shamelessly stepped up instead. And I could realize why. It was because of the other students who were standing behind Jevan while seemingly supporting him. All of them were aristocrats. One of them especially stood out the most. That guy is... It seemed like I'd seen him before. Is he the captain? He seems to be the one roughly commanding the men surrounding him. He also looked at me and gave me a slightly odd stare. A confrontation between the commoners and the aristocracy in the first training ground, huh? I'm familiar with this situation from somewhere. I was thinking about why I was used to that situation. It turned out that it was similar to the fight between Lin and Romley. However, in the case of Lin, it was a surprise attack, and with Aiden, I think they were about to fight with each other. I had a headache. It was not strange if boys were fighting, even in a world like this, but why did it have to happen when I was on patrol? Moreover, one of them was Aiden, whom I had even been paying attention to since before. Jevan Felio and Aiden. I don't intend to hold you accountable for what hasn't happened yet, so just let's call it a day and go back to the dorm. Professor Ludger, I told you to go back. As Jevan spoke strongly while glaring at Ludger, he clenched his teeth to see if he could challenge the authority of the professor, even though he was having a noble faction on his back. "Why don't you let them be?" It was then I heard a new voice. The student's eyes turned to the entrance that was the opposite of the entrance I had entered from. I saw a man approaching while staring at me from there. Professor Chris. He was Chris Benimore, a new professor and a member of the aristocratic faction who had joined Surin with me at the same time. Chapter 45, A Risky Bet, 2. The atmosphere that had been sorted out flowed strangely after Chris Benimore's appearance. The response of the aristocratic students was particularly passionate, and the reason was simple. Chris Benimore was of noble descent and a professor who pushed other noble students from behind. Ludger stared at him and opened his mouth. "Professor Chris Benimore, I don't understand what you're saying." It's not a difficult sentence to understand because it has a literal meaning. Literal meaning? No matter how we're the professors, we can't control all of our students' behavior. Even from what I heard, it seems that both students are trying to spar on their own, but isn't it too much of an infringement on their freedom for a professor to step up and stop them? Ludger wriggled his eyebrows slightly as he listened to Chris's sly words, but it was also for a very short time. Ludger sneaked a look at the atmosphere of the other students. As he was looking at their reaction, he saw some students nodding at Chris's words. Some even said that it was an abuse of a professor's authority to intervene in a fair spar with each other, even if the professor was Ludger. I got a sharp retort, I see. Chris Benimore was a professor who favored aristocratic students. His appearance raised those students' vigor considerably. Ludger decided to step back. Even so, it can be problematic for students to engage in an arbitrary magic duel without a professor's permission. If these students got badly hurt, it would be a loss even for Surin. Of course, it's true, but how about this? How about what? Both of us are going to observe it. The students buzzed at Chris's words. Professor Ludger and Professor Chris are going to observe it. Do we need to have a magic duel in front of two professors? Just imagining it made them feel burdened and frustrated. Some students were confused, but the aristocratic students were different. Their eyes were filled with a certain shine. Since the professors said that they would step up and observe it themselves, they wouldn't be able to prevent the duel under the pretext of it being dangerous. Or are you going to stop me by saying it's dangerous, Professor Ludger Chelsea? Chris purposely gave a sarcastic smile to provoke Ludger. I didn't know you cared about them so much that you wanted to be overly protective toward them. It's not that I'm overprotective, I'm just considering the chances of possible danger. But if the two of us step up, such a risk won't exist. What do you think? Those two students want to battle against each other. Ludger could roughly guess the situation from Chris's words that seemed to have an explicit intention toward him. Chris Benimore hadn't thought of Ludger Chelsea in a good way since even before that. Unlike Ludger, who was said to be the new professor in Surin from a fallen aristocrat family, Chris was still an active aristocrat. For Chris, who had a strong aristocratic tendency, Ludger's existence itself had annoyed him for a long time. Ludger Chelsea? I haven't liked him since the first time I saw him. Other commoner professors still acted accordingly as commoners. Their behavior was full of rashness, no nobility or restraint at all. But Ludger was different. He shone more than anyone else on his spot. He was much more aristocratic than the aristocracy themselves. He didn't lose his shine, even when he was a mere fallen aristocrat. Chris didn't like it. What's so good about the downfall that made him stand stiff with his neck tightened? Was he not even embarrassed about it? It was the same when he had met Ludger for the first time. Chris had thought something was churning inside his stomach as he looked at Ludger's behavior, who just nodded his head without showing any surprise at all when he saw Chris. I didn't like it when Professor Hugo wanted to ask him to join our faction either. Ludger had even declared in front of Hugo that he would not enter such a place. He felt relieved, but somehow he felt repugnant about it as well. Such a place. What does he mean by such a place? What did he believe in for him to act like that? Chris had heard that Ludger had created a great spell called Source Code, but that was all. Chris didn't understand. The more time went on, his dark feelings toward Ludger only gradually deepened. And at that moment, Chris got a chance to give Ludger a proper blow. What do you think, Professor Ludger? Isn't it enough? I will hear the opinions from the students. Ludger said so and looked back at Aiden. It was a stare that seemingly asked Aiden whether he really wanted to have a magic duel with Jevan. Yes, absolutely. Aiden nodded with firm determination. At first, Aiden thought he wanted to solve the case with nice words without having to fight, but Jevan had crossed the line too far. How could Jevan say such a mean thing to his friend? Aiden couldn't forgive Jevan because of that. Ludger looked back at Chris again while sighing inwardly at Aiden's persistence. Since Aiden said he'd do it, I'll allow him to do it under our observation, like what Professor Chris said. Oh, that's a relief. Then, oh, Professor Ludger, wait a second. What else? Chris had no intention of letting go of that hard-earned opportunity. Why don't we make a bet as well? Bet, that's such a sudden offer. According to my point of view, you seem to care a lot about that commoner kid. He's not a commoner, he's Aiden. I hope you watch out for discriminatory remarks. Ah, Aiden, I see. I didn't know because he didn't take my class. Anyway, I consider Jevan Felio to be a pretty talented wizard. It was obviously flattery, but Jevan already looked thrilled like he had taken that compliment sincerely. Ludger replied in his usual cold voice. So what exactly do you want us to do? To decide who will win the duel. Of course, I'm betting on Jevan Felio here to win the duel. It's funny that a professor said something about making a bet in front of the students. Chris was annoyed by such words, but he managed to hold it back and maintain his smile. So what do you think? Well, if you don't want to, then there's nothing I can do about it. Indeed, if I was Professor Ludger, I wouldn't bet on the losing side either. The students spoke noisily at his words. As Ludger subtly cared about Aiden, then naturally, Ludger and Aiden became rivals to Jevan and Chris. Really, Ludger found Chris's behavior funny. He could have ended it by efficiently refusing that offer and walking away. However, even if he did that, he would not be able to erase his regret afterward. It was Chris who had encouraged the duel that could have been stopped in the first place, and it was Chris as well who subtly irritated him even at that moment. He couldn't just ignore it and pass by. There were too many eyes that were looking at them, and Ludger was annoyed. Why should I step down? So far, he hadn't cared much about Chris, who had been showing his hostility toward Ludger, just because he didn't feel the need to do so. Because he didn't have to occupy his mind with thinking of people who didn't like him from the beginning anyway. But if those people irritated Ludger directly, then the story would be different. Yeah, I'll play along with you for a little bit. He had already wanted to properly check Aiden's real skills with the duel anyway. Ludger nodded. Since Professor Chris wants it so badly, I'll go with such entertainment for once. Oh, that's surprising. I didn't think Professor Ludger would accept this offer. So, which student do you think will win? Aiden, of course. Aiden widened his eyes at Ludger's unwavering voice. Aiden never thought that Ludger would choose him there. The same went for the other students. On the other hand, Chris seemed to know that it would happen. Well, he nodded satisfactorily as if he had looked forward to it happening. Good. What will be the outcome of the bet? Outcome? Well, even though we're professors in Surin, we're still wizards. We're professors who teach the same spellcasting lessons as well. Spellcasting, you said? Ludger asked back, as he was slightly surprised at the remark. Ludger was asking because he really didn't know. But Chris's face turned red because he had perceived Ludger's words as making a fool of him. This damned fallen aristocrat. The mere fact that such a shout didn't come out of his mouth was no different than a display of great patience for Chris. That was one of the reasons why Chris hated Ludger. Chris Benimor had gone into Surin to teach spellcasting class confidently. He was proud of that fact. However, he suddenly found out that a fallen aristocrat named Ludger Chelsea was in charge of the same spellcasting class as him. Moreover, Ludger was in charge of the second year, and Chris himself was in charge of the first year, lower than Ludger's. It was natural for a more competent person to be in charge of a higher year. In other words, Chris Benimor basically had been one stage below Ludger Chelsea already. Ludger had even committed the atrocity of stealing a large number of talented students out of his class by allowing both first and second years to attend his class. He had every reason to dislike Ludger. How dare you think that you're going to be safe after humiliating me that much? In fact, Ludger was not aware of the actions that he had committed. He didn't even know that Chris Benimor was a professor in charge of spellcasting like him. That fact had trampled on Chris Benimor's pride even more severely. Ludger understood Chris's behavior just barely. No wonder. I was wondering why he was strangely hostile toward me. So he's in charge of the same spellcasting class. It was no wonder that Chris was angry. He'd also be full of anger if he was being compared to a professor who taught the same lesson as his. Moreover, he also taught the source code and elemental magic visualization through senses, tips that would normally never be taught in classes. Chris barely calmed down his anger and fixed his glasses. Ahem. Anyway, let's each provide a part of the magic and theoretical fields that we've researched in the spell-casting world. Oh, of course, it shouldn't be at the level of being an important piece of our research data, but shouldn't we do that much to make a bet? Shouldn't you also specify how high the level of theory that we need to provide is? We'll leave it to our own discretion. Our own discretion. There was nothing more difficult to understand than those words. It was like saying to put in an appropriate amount of ingredients when compared to things like food. If he gave a piece of information that was ridiculously useless, he would be revealing that his level was only to that extent. But if he gave a piece of information that was too good, it might cause an enormous amount of damage. In the end, the term appropriate among wizards meant that it was right in the middle line that wouldn't damage their reputation and wouldn't make them suffer too much from the damage. Ludger didn't really care either way, so he decided to accept it. All right, but it's too much for them to have a duel right now, so let's take some time before starting the duel. How long do you want to wait then? 3 days will be fine. We'll have an open duel then. 3 days, huh? Well, it'll suffice. If they waited longer, there was a chance for the opponent to take some kind of measure to counter the student they were fighting, so 3 days was the limit. Even geniuses couldn't learn new magic that was being taught to them within 3 days. It was really all about analyzing the opponent for the rest of the 3-day period or maintaining the best body condition. Then let's gather here again in 3 days. Of course, it was an open match with the consent of 2 professors. It was enough to spread a big wave throughout the entirety of Surin in a flash when everyone scattered to spread the rumor about the meeting. Aiden was at a loss when seeing Ludger, who was still in his spot. Thinking that Ludger might have been carried along by the incident just because of him, he opened his mouth while being determined to at least apologize because he felt guilty. Professor Ludger, I'm sorry, just because of me? Never mind. Ludger cut Aiden off coldly. Pardon, but... It's already happened, Aiden. What you need to be concerned about right now is not how to be sorry for what has happened, but how to win against Jevan Felio in the duel. Oh, that's right. Ludger's words were correct because it was too late to regret the past. But Aiden wasn't confident about something. He didn't realize it when his anger surged, but when he thought about it rationally, it was unclear whether he could win against Jevan or not. He was just a beginner in learning magic, but Jevan wasn't a beginner. What are you contemplating so much about? Ludger glared at Aiden and cornered him strongly. Are you going to say you can't do it now? That's. Aiden, you told me you'd do it yourself. Then was your answer back then just a lie because you were swept away by the atmosphere and had no choice but to say it? That's not it. Yes. Of course it's not. I accepted it because I knew you were that sincere. But a real fight is different. Jevan comes from an aristocratic family and must have had a personal education even before he entered Surin. Both of you are already different from the starting point, so you also knew it well. Aiden was unable to refute the statement because everything Ludger said was right. However, it is too early to conclude that we will definitely lose. Aiden, what do you think is important in a fight? Oh, I'm not sure. Is it skill? Ludger shook his head. No matter how great a person might be, it's common for them to die at the hands of a person weaker than themselves. The world doesn't just run because of power. The outcome of a fight could be overturned in a split second. Then what on earth is it? You already have it. Aiden shut his mouth at Ludger's remark. Ludger must have been talking about the uncommon magic that he possessed. You only have to use it at important moments. There was only one reason why Ludger easily accepted Chris's bet, because he was confident that Aiden would win the fight. But I want to win purely with my skills. But Aiden was different. Aiden was surely grateful for the magic that had let him enter Surin, but he didn't feel like wanting to win the fight with it. Professor Ludger, please give me a lesson. Aiden stared at Ludger with an unwavering gaze. Ludger inwardly felt confused as he was looking down at Aiden with a cold stare. Why is he like this? Chapter 46, A Risky Bet, 3. Honestly, when Chris first offered me a bet from a duel between Aiden and Jevan, I hadn't shown it through my expression, but I was secretly pleased. Because it was a bet where I was bound to win. I wasn't saying that Jevan's skill was not good enough. He was also a student who was walking on the magic path and had entered Surin. Obviously, he had some talent and sufficient skills. Rich merchant families and aristocratic students had been thoroughly educated since childhood. so it was natural for them to be far ahead of the commoners from the beginning of the semester. Within just 2 weeks after the start of the new semester, the time was still lacking for commoner students to catch up with the aristocracy, but it was okay, because Aiden was different from ordinary students. I wasn't recognizing the kid as a Shounen main character for no reason. Professor Chris Benimore doesn't seem to know that at all. If he was in charge of the first-year spell casting class, he must have checked the list of students who were unique among the first-year students. But nevertheless, Chris didn't value Aiden very much. I realized one fact there. Chris Benimore didn't even give the list of commoner students a look. He probably only memorized the names of students from noble families that he should care about the most. It was a disqualification as a professor, but I understood. He was a person who was born as an aristocrat and had been living as an aristocrat and would continue to live as an aristocrat. Of course, it would be unpleasant to put a commoner who lived in a completely different world from him in his memory. Rather, it was quite wise for him to choose not to even pay attention to those commoners. I didn't intend to blame him for either committing discrimination or judging them by status, because that place was that kind of world, but he must have never thought that it would hold him back. Aiden was able to enter Surin, even if he lacked magical knowledge, purely because of the uncommon magic that he had. He received some kind of admissions benefit, but that didn't mean Aiden had a bad ability. The principal wanted more students who had learned rare magic to gather in Surin. It is probably too late for Chris to realize what kind of magic Aiden learned. The bet was already settled. Insisting on invalidity was rather an action that would reveal his lack of information, which he did not check in advance. Even if Chris realized Aiden's ability afterwards, he would have no choice but to continue the bet. But what the hell is this guy saying? What? He wanted to win just by using his strength for a brief moment. I didn't understand what the hell he was talking about. I had no choice but to belatedly realize how single-minded and righteous Aiden was. He was a person who came forward to help even the werewolves who had threatened his life. I was thinking of telling him to come to his senses, but I was slightly concerned about it. It might not be a bad idea to take this opportunity to check it out. I wonder what level it was that Aiden possessed. Yes. Just as he said, if I only pushed him to use uncommon magic, wasn't it just pushing him to only rely on one tool? It didn't seem that bad to make certain of his volition and talent for learning something new. The casting of elemental properties was so basic that it was impossible to argue about Aiden's talent with that alone. Then, I'll have to teach him something more certain. I glanced down at Aiden. As he felt my gaze, I could see Aiden's shoulder shudder. Aiden? Yes, yes. If that's what you want, then fine. For the remaining 3 days, I will teach you how to prepare for the duel. Pardon, are you serious about that? But that's... The dice have already been cast. Maybe Professor Chris will also give Jevan some advice or teach him some basic magic techniques. This isn't a match between Jevan and you, it's a matter of pride between me and Professor Chris, as professors, as wizards. Then, am I also going to learn magic from Professor Ludger? I shook my head. Teaching magic was impossible in the first place. There is no victorious magic that I can teach you. There are only 3 days left in the first place. That's a ridiculously short amount of time to learn something in the meantime. Implementation of elemental properties was completely basic. There was no need to review it anymore. But that doesn't mean there's nothing for me to teach you. A duel between wizards did not happen purely with magic, speed of spell implementation, having a massive amount of mana, magic accuracy. No, those alone were not enough. It was nothing more than a preconception that when a wizard fought, they only fought with magic. Aiden, I'll teach you how you should fight when you fight against a wizard. Really? Yes, but the remaining time is 3 days. What I can teach will be a very basic thing because the time is tight. It will be very hard. You may fail as well. Do you still want to do it? Yes, I will do it, Aiden answered loudly in determination. Yes, that was a good attitude. Of course, I didn't mean to go easy on him, even if he refused to learn it. Then let's get started today. Pardon? Are you sure? Aiden's face became slightly stunned because he didn't know that we would start right away. I nodded and glanced at the two people who were watching both of us from a distance. The same goes for both of you. Pardon? Us too, Leo and Tessie. When I called them, both of them were confused but couldn't refuse me. Of course, it wasn't like Aiden was the only one who was going to move, and they seemed like they were going to stay together forever. If I was going to improve the skills of one of them, I had to pour my teachings to all 3 musketeers. The remaining time was 3 days. Chris and Jevan must have been celebrating it early, thinking that they would win. I had no intention of disturbing their toast of celebration. It was up to them if they wanted to celebrate prematurely in their imagination. However, would they be able to enjoy their freedom even after seeing what was going to happen in 3 days? Just a little bit. I started to look forward to it. I'm dying. On a dark night when the sun was completely gone returning to the dormitory, Aiden dragged his tired body to lie down on the bed. He was proud to have never missed a single training since he had arrived at Surin, but Ludger's training was beyond his imagination. Was it because he was a soldier? As Aiden recalled Ludger's hard training, who was teaching Leo and Tessie along with him, he massaged his aching body. I didn't expect that I would use my body that much. What Ludger taught them was not spellcasting or spell technique, but it was literally how to use their body. Well, they did use their brain. It was because they had to use their body and brain at the same time. Aiden didn't know how many times he rolled on the floor in the training ground because of that. He couldn't believe he had to do that for another 2 days. Still, I feel like I've improved. Ludger's teaching was hard enough for him to overwork his body, but Aiden carried it out silently without complaining, because he instinctively felt sure that the method was helpful to him. More than that, why did Professor Ludger say he would trust me? Did it mean that he didn't think Aiden would lose to Jevan? Then what on earth was the reason for that? Is it because of the magic I use? There was that kind of probability. Professors basically had the right to browse through students' information. He still didn't understand why Ludger had certainty in him with that alone. Ludger had never seen him using uncommon magic himself, so why was he so sure? The magic he learned was passed on by his teacher himself, so it would be hard to understand the magic just by hearing its name. Does Professor Ludger happen to know anything about my teacher? Aiden closed his eyes with that thought. The day was so tiring that he fell asleep without even thinking about changing his clothes. 2 days later, Aiden was running on the outdoor training ground until he was out of breath. Ha ha! Ludger stood with his hands behind his back on the street where Aiden was running. Aiden accelerated his run further as he saw Ludger. Ludger, who was keeping his hands behind his back, stretched out his right hand. At that moment, a white monosphere flew toward Aiden from Ludger. Urgh. Aiden turned sideways while clenching his teeth as he looked at the sphere, and when he was about to cast a spell at the same time, tack. Oh! He twisted his legs and fell on the spot. Aiden had avoided the magic, but he had to roll several times on the ground. Ludger slowly approached Aiden. Mana circulation and moving your body are separate things. Don't try to overlap them, but perceive them separately. Yes. Aiden, who was covered in dirt, stood back up from his spot. You failed again this time, so do another lap. Run around? Yes. Aiden ran around the training ground once again. Leo and Tessie, who were resting on chairs in the training ground, stared at Aiden like they were looking at a devoting monster. Oh my God. We are already tired and don't have the strength to run anymore, but Aiden really has the stamina. Tessie was purely admiring Aiden's tireless physical strength. She had been building up her physical strength even before she had entered Surin, but it was not at a level that was even close to Aiden's. She had tried to catch up with Aiden by clenching her teeth, but she had eventually put up the white flag. He's very determined. On the other hand, Leo was the first to take a break because he was physically weaker than Tessie because his body was small. But Leo's ability to see things was sharper. According to what Tessie saw, he looked fine, but Aiden had actually reached his physical limit. Nevertheless, the fact that he kept running was probably due to his determination to not lose in the open duel. HNGGG. Tessie listened to Leo and stared blankly at Aiden. A boy who didn't say that he didn't like her, even though her treatment toward him was so bad. He had smiled and asked her to eat together and reached out his hand as her friend first like a stupid person. She couldn't take her eyes off Aiden's appearance as he was working hard in his training. He looked dirty with all the sweat and grime, but was it too much for her to think that even that was cool? Before they knew it, Aiden had already run around a full lap and rushed toward Ludger. Ludger raised his hand. It's coming. Leo and Tessie were nervous at the same time. A cold sweat flowed in their clenched fists. Ludger's magic flew toward Aiden, who was gasping and almost on the verge of exhaustion. It was a basic spell of shining stone. It would hurt if he got hit, but it would be easy for Aiden to avoid if he just focused on the magic, as Ludger was going easy on him. The problem was that it was not easy to avoid the magic while running. But Tessie, who saw Aiden twist his body sideways in a running position and avoid Ludger's magic, jumped up from her seat unconsciously. He avoided it? Not yet. The important thing is the next step. It was as Leo said. Aiden needed to avoid the magic and then strike back. Aiden immediately gathered his mana. Without stopping his run, he used his mana and deployed a spell technique. It was a technique that required a wizard to use their head and body separately in order to cast magic while moving their body. At first glance, it might seem simple, but nothing was more difficult than that for a person who had not yet mastered magic properly. It was more difficult than drawing a square with one hand and a triangle with the other hand. A division of thought. And he had to move his body and cast the magic separately. Aiden, if it's you, you can do it. Leo clenched his fist. A wizard must concentrate his mind to the extreme in order to cast their spell. That was why the process of carving magic was important. Because a wizard couldn't move when they used magic. That was why wizards were always exposed to danger. Wizards had taken the method of wrapping a barrier around themselves or shortening their spellcasting so they could safely cast their magic. However, there were some people who took a completely different method. There were people who thought that if it was dangerous if they could not move when using magic, they should just use magic while moving. They were wizards, but they did not just stay still but practiced their magic by training their bodies to the limit. Unlike those who learned and explored magic, they were eccentric people who moved around the world and adventurers who always challenged the unknown to fights. War mages. The method that Ludger taught him was moving magus, the most basic way of fighting that those war mages learned. Hap! Aiden took a deep breath and boosted his mana. He did not stop his legs from running. He didn't even have time to catch his breath. There was no need to talk. The important thing was his will. He moved his body and charged his mana separately at the same time. A magic emerged on Aiden's hands, who was running non-stop. Leo and Tessie, who were watching the scene from a distance, opened their eyes and mouths wide. And the spell that Aiden casted, it was a basic first-tier spell, the same shining stone that Ludger shot at him. Even though it was more insignificant than Ludger's spell and more like a blurry spell than a shining one, he clearly casted the spell properly and it flew towards Ludger. Bomb. However, Ludger lifted his gloved right hand and grabbed Aiden's shining stone easily. Leo and Tessie, who were watching the scene, unwittingly exclaimed, "Ah!" and expressed their frustrations. They thought he could land at least one shot. Ha ha. Aiden, who was gasping, stopped in front of Ludger and regained his breath. Aiden? Ha ha, yes, Professor, you passed. Drop. As soon as he heard Ludger's answer, Aiden sprawled on the ground, with a complacent smile that he finally did it. The duel is tomorrow, so get enough rest for the last time today. Ha ha. Aiden couldn't afford to answer that. Ludger smirked at the sight and turned his back. If it's you, then you can do it. Aiden was too tired and couldn't hear it. Chapter 47, Students Duel 1. Chris Benimore, who received a letter in his private office, read the letter once and immediately burned it down. Yeah, as expected, I already knew it. The report had been sent by a Surin employee. The content of the report was news on Ludger Chelsea. He's eagerly teaching that commoner kid. He's desperate to win the bet, even though he pretended not to be like that, I see. He muttered and laughed at Ludger's desperate attempt, but Chris Benimore didn't stay still either. He turned his head and looked at the boy who was standing nervously in front of him. Jevan Felio. Yes. I think you already know what I want to tell you. Jevan nodded his head with a determined look. Yes, I know it. I have to win this open duel against that arrogant commoner. Just winning the duel is not enough. You should properly show the gap between aristocrats and commoners with overwhelming power. It was a rather hard request to the point that it felt burdensome, but Jevan Felio did not think he would fail. When he heard that Aiden was being taught something by Ludger Chelsea, he was somewhat anxious, but he had Chris Benimor by his side. Take it. Chris threw a chemical bottle at Jevan. This is. Jevan asked back with a bewildered face while looking at the blue liquid filled inside the bottle. It's a mana-boosting drug. Drink it before you enter the duel. Are you for real? But won't I be disqualified if I drink this? No, it's all right. It's the specialty of the Benimor clan to not leave a trace if you take the drug in advance, so you won't get caught. If you drink it, it will boost your power instantly, but it lasts less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes, huh? It's quite short, I see. Yes, of course, it's short. That's why you won't even get caught in the preliminary examination. It doesn't boost your existing mana, but it increases the limit of your mana output, so it's closer to drawing out your mana. The trace of the drug will disappear immediately, leaving only its effect, so watch out for mana exhaustion after half an hour. Jevan gulped at Chris's words. In fact, it was more like a drug that allowed him to use the mana that he possessed all at once. His pride did not allow him to drink such a drug to go against a mere commoner, but if it's for a definitive victory, since Ludger was behind him anyway, he might have received something just like Jevan. Because he was a dirty commoner, he might commit a very serious foul play. Jevan put the boosting drug in his pocket with a stiff face while thinking so. Chris laughed at the sight. Well thought out. Now shall we go? More than half of the seats at the second training center were filled with people who came to see the day's freshman's magic duel, which was about to be held in public. Most of the first-year students had gathered, and that time, the second-year students and other professors were also unexpectedly gathered in between. If it was just a fight between the first years, they would have just passed it by. But if it was a duel where the two professors officially gave them permission and observed it, then it was a different story. Ludger Chelsea, Chris Benimor. The two professors had just been appointed to Surin, and they both had something in common. They were in charge of spellcasting class. However, one of them was a fallen aristocrat, and the other one was a prestigious high-ranking count. They had a considerable difference in their status. Moreover, Ludger supported commoners, and Chris Benimor supported the aristocracy. The upcoming duel went beyond a mere fight between new students into a single-round match between commoners and aristocracy. In the end, who will win? Isn't this a fight between freshmen? Then the aristocracy side has more of an advantage. They have been receiving a private education from a young age, right? But I heard that the commoner freshman who entered Surin this time can't be looked down either, though. I heard he also made a great contribution in the werewolf incident last time. But he still didn't catch the werewolves. Can he be the aristocracy's opponent? We don't know, right? People had been talking a lot about how Professor Ludger helped him. In that case, Professor Chris is helping the other side, though. I don't really know that professor. Is he in charge of the first-year students? Yeah, they're teaching the same spellcasting class anyway, but I think he's quite determined when compared to Professor Ludger. You totally got me. While they were talking like that, the people's eyes were heading to the upper seats among the audience where only the professors could sit. Hey, look, they came. Oh, it's for real, huh? Chris Benimor, who had just entered the professor's seat, sat calmly while keeping his dignity as an aristocrat. Because of his intelligent appearance, the girl student's eyes naturally followed Chris with admiration. Chris also subtly enjoyed such gazes. The way they looked up at him made him realize that he was a greater man. At that moment, the student's buzz grew louder. The buzz was quite different from when Chris had shown up. What? Chris wondered who it was, and it turned out it was that man, Ludger Chelsea. A man with long hair that was tied into a ponytail. His sharp jawline and high nose bridge. His vigorous facial features and deep, calm eyes that made women's hearts cry. His black cotton pants and black dress shirt. His necktie was black as well, and even the long coat on top of it was also black. His overall impression came from the combination of black color, which literally reminded Chris of a raven. With a staff in his right hand, he looked like the head of a prestigious magic family. Whoa. Look at Professor Ludger. His atmosphere is no joke, though. All the students' eyes, which had been distracted by Chris's appearance some time ago, were directed at Ludger. However, Ludger went straight to the empty professor's seat and sat down without even caring about how much attention he received. Did you see that? Yeah. His atmosphere is really no joke. I understand why the rumors about him are so popular. Is he really a fallen aristocrat? I thought he was more aristocratic than other aristocratic professors. Chris clicked his tongue as he overheard the students talking like that. His crude eyes, which did not hide his unpleasant feelings, turned to Ludger, who sat in the next row after him. Ludger should have looked at him as well, but the man was staring at the training ground with expressive eyes, and Chris didn't know what Ludger was thinking. Chris gritted his teeth in response when Ludger seemed to pay absolutely no attention to him. HMPH. His smug attitude will be over now. I will make you feel defeated in front of everyone. That fight would be won by Jevan Felio anyway. Aiden? Wasn't he a commoner? Chris didn't even know there was such a student. He hadn't even checked the list of commoner students. He felt that it was a waste of time trying to check out the list. A commoner is a commoner anyway. Even if those who are not properly educated enter the academy with some special favor in the end, that's their limit. When he was thinking so inwardly, the uproar of the audience reached its peak. Feeling that the uproar was louder than when Ludger appeared, Chris looked back and was able to realize why. Your Honor. You came? Chris jumped out of his seat at the appearance of Alyssa Willow and greeted her. The principal accepted Chris's greeting with a beaming smile. Hello, Professor Chris Benimore. Whoa, there are so many people here, I see. What brings Your Honor here? I heard that something interesting happened, so I came to see it since I have spare time. I see. The professors who followed the principal to assist her were Mary Ross, in charge of pharmacy, who was known to have been Surin's longest-serving professor, and Hugo Berdag, who led a faction of the aristocratic professors, which included Chris. When all the most famous people from Surin gathered, the students expressed their surprise, as they didn't know that the duel at that time was going to be so great. It was the same with Chris. He just thought the two students would fight moderately and then end their duel, so he didn't expect the principal to show up. As expected, was the principal bound to show up because it was a fight between a commoner and an aristocratic student. The principal was nominally completely neutral without siding with either faction, but Chris knew that the principal valued the commoner students more than those from the aristocracy instead. That's why Hugo was at odds with the principal in the first place. Is it going to be okay? Even after the principal showed up, the man just sat still without looking back. What an extremely insolent act. But he thought that it was just like Ludger's usual self, so Chris was annoyed with himself for some reason. Professor Ludger, long time no see. The principal greeted Ludger first with a bright smile. Only then did Ludger's head, which was still, turn to see the principal. He slowly rose from his seat and bowed to the principal. Hello, Your Honor. Yes, have you been well, Professor Ludger? How are you? Yes, I have been well. I was really surprised. Suddenly I heard that Professor Ludger and Professor Chris would watch the students' duel. I was wondering what was going on. We just made a simple bet. Bet, huh? Who did you bet on winning, Professor Ludger? The principal asked subtly as if she wanted to hear it from Ludger himself, even though she already knew the answer. I betted on Aiden's victory. A bet doesn't work unless each party chooses the opposite, so does Professor Chris bet on Jevan Felio's victory? Yes, you are right. Chris had no choice but to reluctantly answer. The principal smiled beamingly and clapped her hands. I'm really looking forward to it. Of course, the priority is for the students not to get hurt, right? You don't have to be concerned about it. We've prepared as much safety equipment as possible. Mary Ross answered from the principal's side instead. No matter how formal the duel between students was, it was highly likely for them to hurt the other person. Therefore, they put on light protective gear in advance before entering the duel. They were metal protectors that could be attached to the chest, shoulders, and knees. The metal protectors resonated with each other and created a thin barrier of magic over the students' bodies. The mana energy of the barrier would be consumed to prevent external magic shocks. In other words, it was a safe method that wouldn't put someone's life in danger at all. Someone would be defeated when all of their barrier's energy had been consumed. Then it's a relief. Oh, the participants arrived just in time. The first person to stand at the center of the training ground was Aiden, who looked very nervous. He looked like he was already going to throw up because he was not used to the spotlight. However, he felt like he was desperately holding it in because it was the position he had to bear with after all. Aiden, cheer up. Just break that impudent Jevan's nose. Thanks to Tessie and Leo, who shouted and cheered at him in a loud voice, Aiden nodded his head with a more comfortable face and waved to the audience. The commoner students cheered wholeheartedly for Aiden, hoping that he would boost the status of the commoners. At that time, Jevan appeared through the opposite entrance. Jevan, we believe only in you. Show us the pride of the aristocracy. The aristocratic students cheered for Jevan. Jevan nodded with his smug smile as if he was already familiar with this situation. The two stood face to face. Jevan mocked Aiden. You didn't run away, huh? Are you nervous? Tusk, I'm sure commoners are not used to this kind of position. Why didn't you just run away? If you had run away, you wouldn't have had to suffer a horrible defeat in front of everyone. If I win. Huh. You should apologize for saying harsh words to Tessie, to Leo as well. What? Ha ha ha! Jevan burst into laughter as he didn't expect Aiden to say such words there. All right, if you win, I'll kneel for you. I definitely heard those words. But I'll only have to do that after you win against me, though. Jevan was confident. The powerful mana that filled up his body. It was from the mana-boosting drug that he drank just before going on stage. The item duration lasted for such a short time that no one would know if he used it or not. There was a condition that he had to fight properly and win in less than 5 minutes. But with this power, it didn't seem that it would be very difficult to do so. If we're using the same magic anyway, my body that is currently overflowing with mana will win. There was nothing more advantageous than firepower in a wizard duel. Even if both of them casted the same magic at the same speed, he could overpower Aiden with his strength. Jevan was in a state where it was possible for him to do so. It was only 5 minutes, but it was a very sufficient amount of time. Before entering the duel, the judge had checked the conditions of Aiden and Jevan's bodies. It was to check if irregularities were involved in their bodies before the duel. Jevan took Chris's word for the inspection, so he agreed to do it proudly. In fact, the judge could not notice the irregularities in Jevan. The judge, who checked Aiden's body conditions soon after, opened his eyes wide when he saw the object hanging on his waist. Student, what's this? Oh, this is my own staff that I'm going to use for the duel. Aiden replied with a smile, but the judge still looked confused. It was because Aiden's staff was different in shape when compared with the staves with a unique material that was usually handled by wizards. The staff was in the form of a sword. Chapter 48, Students Duel 2. The judge wanted to ask why he brought a sword for the magic duel, but the shape of the sword was somewhat strange. The tip of the sword was blunt, and the thick blade looked like it was an object meant to strike, not to cut. It was more like a magic staff in the shape of a sword instead of an actual sword. So in fact, the danger and killing power of the sword itself were both close to zero. The judge contemplated on it for a while before letting it slide, thinking that it would be okay. All right. Get in your positions, you two. At the judge's instruction, Aiden and Jevan stood at opposite ends of the stadium. The audience, which was shouting out loud, also shut their mouths and became quiet. Silence fell in the second training ground. At the center of the training ground, Aiden and Jevan stared at each other with intense gazes. Start! As soon as the judge's shout was heard, the two aimed their staves at each other. At the same time, they weaved their mana like threads to cast their magic spells. The first spells were to check whether they could deal damage to the other person. The most fundamental aspect of a match between wizards was for each to analyze the gap between the opponent and themselves. It was done with a first-tier spell exchange. Zop. The spell that Ainz casted was a first-tier water property release type spell, flowing water. On the contrary, the spell Javan casted was shooting fire, a first-tier fire property release type spell. Oh, they're fast. Is it the same speed? Their spells were casted at the same time with no obvious way to tell who had implemented their technique faster. In other words, Ainz, whom people had originally thought the duel would be disadvantageous for, had implemented his spell technique faster than expected. And there was also a difference in the elements that were casted by the two. Ainz had shot water. On the other hand, Javan had shot fire. It was needless to ask which attribute had a greater advantage, as expected. Ainz exclaimed inwardly with joy. In order to take away the dominant position from the opponent in the first exchange, it was necessary for him to occupy the advantageous position with the correct elemental property. It was a sort of rock, paper, scissors, but it wasn't just determined with luck. I already thought that Javan would use a fire element spell. If Javan hated him and had a fiery personality, Ainz predicted that it was highly likely that the magic he used first would be fire magic. And he was absolutely right. Ainz had read the opponent's magic in advance through psychological warfare and had prepared the magic that would counter it. Some students might have thought that it was just a coincidence, but the professors were different. Ooh, he's already leading the fight from the start. Hugo retorted sharply while not hiding his expression of discomfort from the principal's side, who spoke joyfully. The winner has not been decided yet. Just as Hugo said, the situation did not lead to Ainz's victory. Water and fire, when the two magics collided in the air, contrary to people's predictions, it was the flame that eliminated the water magic. Oh my gosh. What? He beat the water with fire? Is the difference in their mana that big? No matter how dominant one property was over another, if the opponent's mana was higher, even such dominance would be ignored. Javan was exactly like that. The flame evaporated the water in an instant and soon flew toward Ainz. Ainz hurriedly bowed down to avoid the flying flame, and his incredulous gaze was directed at Javan. "Ha ha, did you see that? This is the difference between you and me, you petty commoner." Javan didn't stop utilizing his mana, even when he was talking. While Ainz moved to avoid the flame, he immediately prepared the next spell. Ainz also immediately invoked his spell as he fixed his posture. That time, each of them casted first-tier magic again. Javan shot out a lightning element, and Ainz shot out a fire element. Boom! The two spells collided and canceled in the air. However, if there was an evident difference, the place where the magic was canceled was a little closer to Ainz. Ainz was being pushed back. "Ha ha, is that everything you can do?" Javan used his mana again, and so did Ainz. Both spells collided again in the air. Ainz knew that he was almost being pushed back by Javan's firepower, so he put in more mana and casted his spell. Boom! The third collision happened right under Ainz's nose. He was getting pushed back. Urgh. Ainz stumbled due to the shock of the magic explosion. Ainz was pushed back. As expected, is there nothing he can do as a commoner? Javan was excited to hear those people chatting among themselves in the audience seats. He was going to take the opportunity and end the duel completely. They had used magic at the same time not long before, but in their next exchange, Javan was much faster. Javan casted his spell again. Ainz straightened up his posture and tried to aim his staff for defense, but immediately corrected his action. No. It's too late to use magic now. Javan had already entered into a stage of spell implementation. Even if he tried to catch up to Javan in a hurry, Javan would still cast his spell first in the end. If he was focused on speed and used a simple spell, his magic was highly likely to fail. Javan's power was also overwhelmingly dominant. In that situation, if he had Ludger's source code, he could cast a spell first to knock down his opponent, because it's impossible in the first place. Before that, he realized that their speed of spell technique implementation was the same, so it was time for him to take a different method. From here on, I'm going to use what I learned from Professor Ludger. He had been practicing hard until he had torn himself apart in the last 3 days for that, after all. Instead of aiming with his staff, Ainz stormed out of his spot and rushed toward Javan. What? Is he going to run over there? Did he give up? There were bursts of confusion everywhere. Most of the audience thought Aiden was giving up everything and just throwing his body at his opponent. The fact that he used his body was an unwise judgment as a wizard. Was he going to rush in and punch Jevan? Barbaric, so commoner-like. Aiden, what on earth are you going to do? While everyone was either looking down on Aiden or feeling ashamed, Jevan's spell had been completed. Ha! Are you giving up because you know you can't win in the end? Jevan used the second-tier spell Burning Thunder with a cruel smile. It was a very powerful spell among second-tier spells that pierced the opponent's body like lightning with a quick bolt. He wouldn't die because he had a safety device on his body, but considering the overflowing mana in it, the spell could make Aiden feel pain as if he were dying. Jevan aimed the spell exactly at Aiden's forehead. Take it? Aiden was running fearlessly towards him. Commoners are commoners, after all. That must have been Aiden's limit. Jevan thought so while invoking the Burning Thunder, ZZZZZZT. The yellow current in the air soon became an arrow and flew toward Aiden. Everyone watching the scene thought the duel was over. It's over. Jevan won in the end. Chris smirked as he watched the duel go in the direction that he expected. He had already looked back at Ludger while looking forward to what kind of ruined face he would show. What? Ludger was just staring silently at the duel with his casual face, as if the duel wasn't over yet. Chris's eyes rushed to look to the stadium. In his eyes, at the same time, he saw Aiden responding to the magic that was flying at him. Aiden avoided the magic that was flying straight at him while he was running by turning his upper body and head sideways. ZZZZT. Uwag. The Burning Thunder flashed past Aiden's cheeks and shoulders. Aiden's face was slightly distorted due to the pain, but that was all. Aiden didn't stop. Chris was inwardly shocked to see the sight. He noticed how Aiden had avoided the attack. Even in the midst of his disadvantage, he didn't take his eyes off his opponent. Usually, when new students engaged in a magic duel, those who were not yet familiar with fights between wizards tended to act like beginners. They might turn their eyes away from their opponent, or they might close their eyes and raise their arms instead of defending themselves against the magic. When they realized that pain was approaching, their body instinctively moved. That couldn't be helped, because it was a human being's instinct. There was no way to reduce that but to train for a long time. But Aiden was a freshman who had just entered the academy. He was a beginner who didn't know much about magic. Wasn't he a commoner who didn't have the environment to receive education like others? But Aiden was not scared and did not stop running while not averting his eyes even though the magic flew toward his forehead. He did not simply avoid the magic by luck. Courage. A strong will to overcome pain. It was possible because there was confidence that he would avoid the magic which was accompanied by courage. No. It will still take time for him to get back into his position and use magic from over there. Chris's judgment was correct since Jevan still had the lead anyway. As if to live up to his thoughts, Jevan also took action. After being bewildered for a moment when he realized that his attack was off the mark, Jevan prepared the next magic. There was no time for Aiden to use magic, as he was still moving. However, Jevan was bound to open his eyes wide when he saw Aiden's spell technique was being formed under his nose. It was the same for Professor Hugo, Mary, and the principal, who whistled with interest, not to mention Chris. He immediately noticed the technique that Aiden used. Moving Magus? Moving Magus. A skill for actual fighting that war mages learned to use by casting magic while moving their bodies. Chris turned his head and looked back at Ludger. The man hadn't taken his eyes off the duel since a while ago. He had a slight, faint smile on his mouth. No way did he teach this to Aiden. Sin, it was a victorious spell. There must not have been enough time for Ludger to teach such a thing, so there must have been a limit to Ludger's method when he was teaching it. That was why Chris had handed over the mana-boosting drug to Jevan. It was all right for him to act cowardly. Just win the duel. But Ludger wasn't like that. In a short period of 3 days, that man had taught that commoner the moving magus, a skill that put him one step ahead of his opponent in the duel. He learned that only in 3 days, no. Of course not. It wasn't that Ludger had taught him in 3 days. Aiden had mastered the moving magus in only 3 days. A mere commoner was born with that talent. Chris didn't know how hard and fiercely Aiden had been practicing under Ludger's teaching, while Jevan and Chris had already spent their time complacently and were drunk on the toast of victory. He didn't know how much they had worked behind the scenes to change things when Chris and Jevan had hastily concluded that nothing would change. He would never know about it. He probably wouldn't know even after someone told him that. That was how ridiculous he thought the current situation was. "Jevan, you stupid brat. Stop your spell." Chris wanted to shout it out, but the last remaining rationality that he had kept his mouth shut. If he shouted to give instructions toward Jevan there, it was an act that would ruin the fair duel and undermine his own image. He had no choice but to just wish that Jevan would notice by himself and take another action. I was wrong. Chris closed his eyes tightly. Jevan was preparing for the next spell, as he never expected Aiden to use magic while running. It would have been better for him if he had been puzzled by Aiden's dodge and stopped preparing his next attack. However, Jevan's natural ability became a shackle to his ankles in the middle instead. He had quickly responded to the abnormal situation that he encountered for the first time. There was nothing wrong with his judgment, but Jevan could not respond at all to the abnormal situation that was unfolding not only once but twice in a row. Oh! After belatedly witnessing a completed spell technique in front of him, Jevan realized that the situation was going awry. However, there was no way he could complete casting the current spell technique first. The spell that Aiden shot was the shining stone that he had practiced so much. It was a simple first-tier spell technique. But it was very deadly, as it was a spell that was casted amidst an opponent's carelessness and surprise. Boom! The shining stone penetrated through Jevan's spell and destroyed it. The spell did not stop there, but it also hit Jevan's forehead hard. Arg! It was not fatal, but it did not completely erase the pain. The giddy shock in front of his eyes caused Jevan to fall backward. His movements slowed down, and the accident froze him as if he was submerged in icy water. The short attack didn't even take 5 seconds. The attack played a decisive role in determining the outcome of the fight. Jevan stood up hesitantly. But Aiden, who had taken over the opportunity to attack, did not just stand still and watch. "So it's over." Ludger was pleased at the sight. The flow of the fight completely leaned toward Aiden. If it were a brawl that was decided with fists, there would still be a possibility for Jevan to win somehow. But a magic duel didn't flow that simply. It was a fight that was thoroughly decided by flow. From the moment a wizard lost his condition and lost the flow of the fight, their defeat was already set. Aiden aimed his staff at Jevan. "Now it's my turn." And no. But despite Jevan's cry, Aiden's spell, which had been invoked immediately, hit Jevan's body countless times. As soon as the total amount of defensive mana armor surrounding Jevan's body reached 0, the outcome of the duel was decided. Chapter 49, Anti-Magic 1. The duel was over. The winner, Aiden. Along with the judges' yell, shouts erupted from the audience. All of them were shouts of the commoner students who had come to cheer for Aiden. "Aiden, you're cool. You are so dope. You are awesome. When on earth did you learn that skill?" Leo and Tessie's joy was particularly significant. On the contrary, the aristocratic students openly expressed their displeasure and then glared at Jevan, who was sprawled on the floor in defeat. "Tusk. Jevan, that punk, has disgraced the honor of the aristocracy. He was always a sucker. He was a mere baron, yet he was trying to sponge off us like he was something, and that became bothersome. I can't believe he lost against a commoner. He's a disgrace to the aristocracy." Words that could be heard noisily were very sharp. Jevan looked around with a blank face. "I lost." He couldn't believe that it was real, but when he tried to wake up from this dream, he didn't wake up. Because it was not a dream, it was a reality. The scornful gazes and the criticism that flew at him were all real. On that stage, it was not him, but a petty commoner that he had been looking down on so much who was drunk with the joy of victory. No. Something must be wrong here. There was no way he had lost. Yes, there must have been some mistake. That dirty commoner must have used some kind of cowardly foul play. If that wasn't the case, then there was no way that he could use magic while moving. This damned commoner brat, Grit. Jevan had erased the fact that he secretly drank a potion and doped because of it from his head. If he knew that it was a shameful act in the first place, he wouldn't have done that. All he had left was endless hatred for the commoner who had insulted him in front of everyone, and his will to murder the commoner. "I will kill you." Jevan began to wring out all of his mana. When everyone was so focused on Aiden, who was within the spotlight as the winner, no one would notice Jevan's behavior. Anyone would think so. Who would expect that a man who had lost a fight would suddenly get up and use a spell as a surprise attack? Jevan squeezed out all of his mana and prepared a second-tier spell. It would take about 4 seconds before the spell was casted. It was quite a long duration if his opponent was focused on him and dealt with the spell, but 4 seconds was a very short duration when everyone was off guard. Oh. Aiden was the first to notice the oddity. Something was wrong with the spirit that Jevan radiated as he was bowing his head. Just as he looked back at Jevan, his eyes met Jevan's, who was glaring at him. Jevan. Jevan's eyes, which were glistening due to murderous intent, were bent like crescent moons. And what Aiden saw was the spell technique that he was secretly implementing. It was a second-tier fire magic, Raging Wave. Now that the duel was over, Aiden had removed the safety device attached to his body. Moreover, Raging Wave was an attack with the widest scope among the second-tier magics, making it practically impossible for him to avoid it. However, it was impossible for him to defend himself from it because time was running out. The magic had been casted. Red flames swirled and surged toward him. "Oh, ooh!" The judge, who was about to check Aiden's physical condition, was also bewildered. Never thinking that Jevan would do it, he hurriedly took out his cane and charged his mana. He was a Surin employee, but he could also use magic to some extent. But it was too late. The spell had already reached just under his nose. The hot flame approached them like a wave that was about to engulf them. Whoosh. Aiden moved his body first before even thinking. Aiden, who bounced like a spring, grabbed the back of the judge's neck, then threw the judge to his back. Then he clasped the sword-shaped staff with his hands. Within the slow flow of time, he could see the surprised audience with their eyes wide open. The professors also jumped from their seats one by one as they belatedly realized the situation. But it was already too late for them to step up, because the waves of flame had just reached Aiden. "Aiden!" Tessie's cry echoed throughout the stadium, but Aiden didn't look back at her. He kept his eyes fixed to the front and lifted his sword-shaped staff. He charged his mana and struck the flame. Woo-wash. Oh, what? Then something unbelievable happened. Following the trajectory of Aiden's staff, the magic of Raging Wave that Jevan had used was split precisely down the middle and scattered. Weirr. Eventually, the Raging Wave lost its power and disappeared after it was scattered into the air. What was just happened? He cut the spell. While the students murmured blankly at the incomprehensible sight, Ludger stared at Aiden as if he knew that would happen. Did he use that spell because it was a moment of crisis? Aiden was a wizard who could use uncommon magic. Unlike the other 4 types, uncommon was not properly classified by modern magic, and spells that weren't widely known formed a mainstream classification. It was the same with what Aiden had just used, one of the uncommon magics, anti-magic. In other words, a spell that erased another spell. What Aiden used was exactly that. No way. Chris was simply on the verge of fainting. He was already going crazy because of Jevan's cowardly act, and to make things worse, Aiden, whom he thought was a commoner, had used anti-magic. Don't tell me. That man already knew it. Chris's gaze turned to Ludger. He had sat still in his seat and wasn't surprised when Aiden was attacked. It's not that he wasn't surprised. That man had no reason to be surprised in the first place, because he already knew everything. He had known that Aiden would win the competition, and that Aiden was the owner of an uncommon magic. Oh my God. It was the same with Jevan Felio. When he saw the Raging Wave that he had used with all his mana disappear in vain, and the fact that Aiden was the one who cut the spell off, he looked stunned. Aiden walked toward Jevan, who had completely lost his fighting spirit. Jevan? How the hell did you do that? How come a commoner used that magic? That's it. Clench your teeth. What? Before Jevan could ask again, Aiden moved. Bomb. His clenched fist hit Jevan's cheek hard. Jevan's body rolled on the ground. Looking down at the fallen Jevan, Aiden spoke while glaring strongly at him. I thought that you'd at least take your defeat well, but I didn't know that you would be this much of a piece of trash. Jevan could not answer him. He had already been completely physically and mentally defeated by Aiden, so he could not maintain his rationality. The judge belatedly rushed out and checked Aiden's body. Aiden, are you all right? Yes, I'm all right. But are you all right, mister? Are you hurt anywhere? Oh no, thanks to you, I'm grateful. I would have been in danger if it weren't for you. Aiden said that it was nothing to the judge, who kept his head bowed down and apologized instead. The professors and audience who were watching the scene were bound to see Aiden in a new light. Oh my God. I heard he's an anti-magic owner, so it was real. Mary Ross, who had already vaguely heard some news about Aiden, put her hand around her mouth and chuckled. Hugo's and Chris's expressions, on the other hand, were simply dejected. It was just Ludger who had been expecting that to happen and maintained his unchanging attitude. The student's response was simply enthusiastic. Did you see that just now? He cut the magic with a blade. You idiot, it's not a blade but a staff. Whatever it is. Even so, I didn't feel him casting a different spell. What the hell was that? He erased magic. Is that possible? For the students who did not know about the existence of anti-magic, Aiden's performance was almost like a fairy tale. After an incredulous thing done by Jevan, Aiden's magic was so great that even the incredulous event could be forgotten in an instant. Among the surprised students, there were some who noticed what Aiden's magic actually was. That kid, did he just use anti-magic? A beautiful girl with white hair and a snow-cold impression stared intensely at Aiden. Her tone seemed to consider Aiden lower than her, but she was also one of the freshmen who had just entered Surin. The girl was definitely enough to be discussed as the one who held the best position among Surin's freshmen. She was the top student who had entered the academy that year and the most promising extraordinary rookie from the Magic Tower. Julia Plumhart. She looked at Aiden with interest. I just wanted to kill time at first, so I came to look around here for fun. It turned out that I witnessed something interesting. With her personality, she wouldn't even care about that kind of event, because no one was curious about the result of the students' duel. However, that time, the incident was bigger, and it had moved into a fight between commoners and nobles, and not just one between students. Moreover, the news that it became a pride fight between two professors had spread after that, so she had only come to see the duel briefly. When they fought for the first time, it was so horrible that it was hard for me to keep my eyes open, and I thought I'd go back right away. She was glad she didn't leave. She couldn't believe that she was witnessing anti-magic in a place like that. His name is Aiden, right? Where on earth did a commoner learn to do anti-magic? I got a little interested. Julia left the stadium as she saw Aiden knock out Jevan. Other than Julia, there were also some people who were interested in the magic that Aiden had shown. It was the same for Freuden, who had the most power in his second year and posed as the head of the aristocratic faction. Is his name Aiden when Jevan, the eldest son of Baron Felio who wanted to join his faction, said he would fight Aiden? Freuden hadn't bothered to stop him. His true intention was that he didn't even care about it in the first place. No matter who Jevan fought with, he thought that it was okay as long as Jevan didn't become aggressive toward him. Who would have thought that the opponent whom Jevan had fought against was a commoner who could use anti-magic? I heard that all the newcomers in the first year can't be looked down on, so it was true. Freuden had a personality that could admit things neatly. He highly valued Aiden's anti-magic. Of course, he didn't know how much Aiden could deal with anti-magic, but his value as a human being was at least higher than that of the aristocracy. Let's go. Freuden stood up from his seat while glancing at Jevan, who had fallen with a pathetic stare for the last time. The students from his faction stood up in lines following Freuden. Before Freuden left, he glanced sideways at Ludger. who was sitting in the professor's seat. That professor, Freuden, who had been staring at him for a while, soon turned his eyes as if he was not interested in him and left the stadium. That was how the people left one by one and made a lot of ruckus about the duel incident that day, the appearance of a new prodigy. Aiden, a wizard who could use anti-magic. Oh my. Aiden scratched his head. He originally had no intention of using anti-magic in the duel. Well, he also didn't intend to use it in the future while studying in Surin. His teacher had said that such magic was very important, so he shouldn't use it unless he was really in a crisis. If he didn't do what his teacher told him to, he would be in trouble. So this is what my teacher meant. Looking at the passionate eyes of the students who already had high expectations of him, Aiden instinctively felt that his life at the academy would be very tiring in the future. Oh, yeah. Aiden immediately turned his head to the place where the professor-only seats existed. It was to find Ludger, who had helped him win the fight. Fortunately, Ludger remained in his place, and it was not difficult for Aiden to find him. Ludger's black outfit definitely stood out. Ludger had his usual expression on his face and wasn't visibly happy about Aiden winning the duel. After both of them looked at each other in silence, Ludger just nodded his head once. Of course, that was enough for Aiden. When Ludger admitted that he did well, Aiden finally realized that he had gained the victory. Aiden, you did well, you won. Tessie and Leo came up to Aiden and smiled beamingly. Aiden also smiled at his friends. After watching the three for a while, Ludger got up from his seat. Because the duel was over, it was time for another business. Professor Chris. Chris Benimor, who had been standing uncomfortably in his spot the entire time, shuddered at Ludger's call. His eyes turned to Ludger. We still had our own business left, right? Chris's face collapsed even more disastrously at his words. Chapter 50, Anti-Magic 2. Chris thought that something destined had finally come. He had made a bet with Ludger. They had decided who would win the contest among their students, and declared that the loser would give one of their magic research papers to the winner for free. It was Chris himself, and not anyone else, who had suggested it first. He had declared that he would make the bet in front of many students, so he couldn't even make an excuse and say no. Chris tried to say something, and he glared at Ludger sharply. Did you already know that the commoner student is an owner of anti-magic? Yes, you are right. Chris shouted out full of rage at the answer that Ludger gave as if it was too obvious. Did you make this bet even after you knew it? I don't understand why Professor Chris is so angry. What nonsense? So you didn't know that Aiden is an owner of anti-magic? Chris became tongue-tied at his words. It was just as Ludger had said. He hadn't known that Aiden was an owner of anti-magic. Yes, he hadn't known it, and that was why he had allowed that duel. I heard that Professor Chris is in charge of the first year, but didn't you check on the first years who entered the academy this time? Most of all, Aiden never used anti-magic throughout the whole duel. Did his mastery of anti-magic affect the outcome of the duel? Chris shut his mouth. Just as Ludger said, Chris was not in a position to argue about the match. He could have known it, but it was he who didn't want to know about it. He didn't pay attention to them because they were commoners and because they were insignificant kids. He didn't think paying attention to them was necessary. The narrow-minded way of thinking that he usually had eventually turned around and flew toward him like a boomerang. Who the hell should he blame for that? Was it Ludger, who knew about it but didn't tell him? Was it Aiden, who had learned anti-magic as a mere commoner? No, it was him who was wrong, after all. He didn't even prepare for anything thoroughly and had mistakenly thought that he would definitely win without thinking of gathering any information in advance. His arrogance was the cause of his defeat. If you had checked thoroughly what specialties the students had, an incident like today's wouldn't have happened. Chris just chewed his lips without being able to answer anything. Yes. It was obviously his mistake in not realizing the anti-magic that Aiden had. But what hurt his pride more than that was that the outcome of the duel was not determined by the anti-magic. Aiden didn't even use his anti-magic in the duel. He had simply knocked down Jevan using only what he had mastered and learned since coming to Surin. There was no way he could spit out words such as cowardice or foul play. The moment he said those words, he would have really lost. Looking at Chris, who was shaking and couldn't say anything, Ludger took his luck. "I remember you told me to use a magic academic paper as a price for the bet." "I did." "All right, what can I give you?" "Nothing." Chris was puzzled by his words. "Now, what on earth?" "I won't take anything." "Anything? Why all of a sudden?" "It's not all of a sudden. I was going to say this from the beginning." Chris couldn't understand his action as he heard Ludger's words. No, he actually understood it, but it was more like he was trying to deny the reality. "It's cheap to rob the others teaching material as the price of a bet." At the end of his sentence, Ludger turned his back and left, as if he had no intention of continuing the conversation with Chris. Chris looked stunned at the sight. "Cheap," he said. He wasn't that annoyed when he was ignored by Ludger or when he had lost the bet. But after Ludger had won the bet and said that the bet itself was cheap while not even taking anything from it, Chris went beyond feeling irritated and even felt a sense of dejection. That man was like a mirror, a heart mirror that reflected his ugly side so clearly. The more Chris glared at him with hostility and growing hatred, the more he felt disgusted by his own appearance that Ludger showed him. Chris Benimore, cheap." Chris bit his lip. A stream of blood ran down his mouth. He didn't even think about wiping it. He only glared at Ludger's back with bloodshot eyes. Ludger jealousy? How much more did he have to trample on Ludger's pride to get rid of his anger? He couldn't forgive him. It was unacceptable. Next time, he would surely repay Ludger with double the amount of humiliation that he had experienced. "Professor Chris." Hugo approached and called him, but Chris did not respond. Not wanting to show his ugly appearance to anyone right then, he hurriedly went away from his seat. Hugo distorted his face at the sight, and he had no choice but to hold his irritation when looking at the principal, who was smiling softly. That would be remembered as a day of great shame for the aristocracy. Ludger jealousy? He was thinking of the man who was the culprit behind all of it. Hugo Bertag gritted his teeth silently. Ainz, who was drunk on the joy of victory with his friends, suddenly remembered the promise he had made with Jevan. His gaze flitted toward Jevan, who was getting up from his spot. The three people looked at each other, then nodded and approached Jevan. "What?" Jevan looked at Ainz and his friends coming toward him and spoke in a weak voice. "Was there anything left for you to laugh at me for? Jevan, you didn't forget the promise you made before the duel, did you?" The word promise made Jevan's face crumple severely. He couldn't think of it because he couldn't get away from the shock of defeat. "Jevan Felio, you should respectfully apologize to my friends here right now for saying harsh things to them." "How dare you? You told me to apologize now." "You were the one who made the bet and participated in the duel, Jevan. I'm just telling you to keep your promise. Hurry and apologize, respectfully." Jevan clenched his fist, but that was all. He was completely defeated by Ainz. Even his surprise attack had failed. It wasn't a mere defeat, it was an ugly defeat after he desperately tried to win. There was no place left for him to stand in Surin. Jevan cried out of frustration. "Damn it, all of it because of you I—" "Jevan, shut up, don't call my name. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have been suffering this ugly appearance in front of everyone. Yes, it's all your fault." Tessie was about to step up, full of rage, when she saw Jevan talking in a frantic state of mind, but Ainz raised his hand to stop her. "Ainz, why?" Ainz knew it. The fact that no matter what Tessie said there, Jevan wouldn't listen to it. Ainz realized something when he saw the action that Jevan showed. Two people had fought because they didn't understand each other, and he believed that the story would have been different if they understood each other. He thought that people could get to know each other while having a conversation with each other, and then they could get closer to each other after that. But Ainz still couldn't forget Jevan's face that had been full of murderous intent. Jevan's expression swayed his thoughts. Meanwhile, Jevan shouted even more desperately. "Damn it! Fucker! Because of you dirty commoners, I can't even stay in Surin anymore. The Felio family can't raise our heads anywhere in the future because of you, because of all of you." Jevan had already erased his foul play and cowardly acts from his memory. He just couldn't understand why he had to go through this to the point that he felt resentful and cheated about it. Why? Why does someone like you have that ability? Why don't I have it? Jevan, damn it, damn it. I just wanted to raise the reputation of my family. Jevan bowed his head and screamed. He wouldn't have stopped, even if he knew the method he used was wrong, because he had that objective as his purpose. Aiden was about to say something while looking at Jevan, but he shut his mouth tightly in that state. It was difficult for them to continue a proper conversation, let alone him receiving an apology from Jevan. Even Tessie, who would normally have been angry while telling people to act properly, was reticent when she saw Jevan's ruined state. She also felt something that was tightening in her chest when she saw Jevan had done that to raise his family's status. Maybe I could have been like that as well. She shuddered with fright at such thoughts. At that moment, a cold voice was heard between them. "What are you doing here? The duel is over." Professor Ludger, who was dressed in all black, had a strange atmosphere that they could not resist. He stared at Aiden and his friends, then glared coldly at Jevan, who was sobbing and collapsed in his spot. "Jevan Felio, what are you doing, showing such an unsightly appearance after you lost in the duel? It's not enough for you to lose the fight. You didn't accept your defeat and even attempted an ugly surprise attack. What's so unfair about it that made you cry? You deserve to cry now, PR Professor Ludger." No matter how bad Jevan's behavior was, Aiden thought that Ludger's words were too harsh, so he stepped up, but Ludger didn't stop. "You are petty, I see. You are so petty. Your current appearance is far worse than the commoners that you have always hated and despised. What do you know?" In the end, Jevan, who couldn't resist Ludger's words, stood from his spot and glared at Ludger. What do you know about what I'm feeling? Do I have to know? What? Do I really need to know that? You. Jevan was about to shout something, but when he saw Ludger's eyes, he swallowed back his words. His burning anger quickly blew out, and fear dominated his emotions instead. Ludger's eyes, and the cold gaze that was directed at him. It was like facing a nightmare in the dark. You picked a fight and you lost the bet. It's all your own fault that you didn't even accept your defeat and collapsed. But after that, you want others to understand how you feel. Why should we know how you feel? That's. You think this place is still your home. Do I look like a babysitter who listens to your complaints? You're such a bad kid who can't even take care of himself, and now you're screaming your anger like a baby bird. You, who doesn't know how shameful your actions are, have been disqualified as a wizard. Aristocrat and wizard, my ass. Jevan couldn't maintain his right mind as he listened to Ludger's nearly violent words that were unlike his usual self. Shut up. I don't even want to listen to your excuse. I'll refer you to the disciplinary committee for your behavior that I saw a moment ago, so get out of my sight now. At Ludger's warning, which was close to threatening, Jevan, whose face turned pale, stepped back with a shaky step and then fled the stadium. The three musketeers, who watched the scene silently from beginning to end, all had the same thoughts. He definitely served Jevan right, but wasn't it too much? Aiden's expression was especially not very good. Aiden? Yes, Professor. You've practiced the maneuver technique properly. Good job. It's all thanks to you, Professor. But you don't look that happy about winning the duel, I see. That's... Aiden could not understand why his mood was so low. Obviously, he had won the duel in front of everyone in a cool way. He could not disagree if someone said he had to be happy about it. Maybe it was because he had heard Jevan scream afterwards. I don't really know why. You don't really know, huh? I obviously felt delighted at first. Jevan humiliated my friends and started a quarrel with me. I'm sure my intention to defeat Jevan remains unchanged. But the problem is after that. Did you just get swayed by Jevan's whining? I definitely didn't have to listen to his words. Yes, it would be enough if I just ignored him, but I couldn't do that. Aiden showed a bitter smile and spoke frankly. Ludger looked at Aiden in silence. He had already known that Aiden had been overly righteous and possessed righteous values since before. But he didn't know that Aiden would have a heart so weak like that. He even had sympathy for Jevan, who had ignored and looked down on him. But if someone asked Ludger if it was a bad appearance, he would say no. Aiden was still young and a student who studied in that shining world called Surin. Because he was a student and still young, that was quite possible. That was okay. Ludger couldn't blame him while saying that Aiden was stupid and that it frustrated him, because that was how he looked at the world. Aiden, Yes, Professor. As you live in this world, one day you will run into various types of people. Pardon? Keep it in your mind. It means that not everyone is like you. Someone will hate you, dislike you, and be hostile toward you. In the end, it's going to be like that because your world and the others' worlds are different. Is that so? But it changes depending on how people behave. Aiden, Tessie, and Leo looked at Ludger as they were slightly surprised at those words. It's not a bad thing to take care of your own things, and your deed that sacrificed your everything is not stupid either. But in the end, what you need to live in this world is moderation. Moderation. Only half of them. Aiden, you can just pick half of selfishness and selflessness. If I give half to someone instead of taking half from them, then there will be a day when both of us understand each other. Aiden looked back at Tessie at Ludger's words. He obviously remembered that his first time meeting her wasn't so good. Tessie was like a rose full of thorns. But at some point the two became close and hung around together often. I'm not telling you not to yield and not to be considerate to others because it seems impossible to you. That's why I said this. It's okay to not be fully considerate of others, but it's also all right for you to be at least half selfish. Half, Aiden felt anxious as he was catching something from those words. I spoke too much. I will leave now. Professor Ludger? What? Those words? I will definitely keep them in mind. Looking back at Aiden, who answered with a determined face, Ludger left the stadium with a light nod. The three stared silently at Ludger's back until he disappeared. For more chapters, join my Patreon, link in description.